Welcome and thanks for your interest in our Engineering Change Lab USA Cybersecurity to Cyber Resilience Summit. Special welcome to those of you who are taking part in your first ECL event. We truly appreciate having your voices as part of the discussion. And welcome also and thank you to our provocateurs.
I've got we're seeing all of your notes as well as your slides right now, if it matters.
Well, that's interesting. I think we'll just stay with that. You guys, you can read them instead of me speaking them. But I don't know why that is.
Mike,
hey, I'll just keep going. So last year we updated our vision for ECL. And as part of that effort, we reiterated our commitment to our purpose that you see there to contribute to a resilient, thriving world by helping the engineering community reach its highest potential on behalf of society. Our vision also includes two major goals for the next 5 years. We want to be widely recognized as an effective thought leader, resource, and catalyst for change within the engineering community. And we want to build a sustainable core organization. We're grateful to those of you who are contributing to our work through service on our board and our committees. And if anyone is interested in learning more about our plans for the future or becoming involved in our work, please reach out to me. In 2019, we received a generous grant from NCEES that allowed us to go into operation. NCEES has awarded us additional grants since that initial award, including this year, and we are grateful for that support. Last year, we also received a grant from the Lemelson Foundation that is targeted toward outside development and fundraising assistance that we hope will lead to building long-term sustainable funding for ECL. Thank you also to the companies listed on the slide who have all stepped up to provide additional financial support. And in addition to that financial support, these companies represent the core stakeholders that make our work possible. This is our board of directors. Most are here as participants and are available to answer questions or listen to ideas about how we can enhance or expand our work. And so with that, I'll introduce Kyle Davey, our ECL Creative Director and Lead Facilitator, who will guide us through today's summit. Kyle?
Well, my welcome as well to all of you. Our objective today is really to take a deep dive exploring the challenge confronting our world of the fact that, complex digital systems that are intertwined with infrastructure and other technology-enabled resources and services are quickly outpacing our ability to deal with the types of cyber threats and dangers, and effectively, putting us at risk, both individually, but more importantly, more significantly from a society perspective in many different ways. We not only want to explore that sort of context in terms of what our world is like, but we also want to really end up focusing in on what should the role of the engineering community broadly be with regard to dealing with that challenge and essentially creating through its stewardship, a cyber resilient critical infrastructure on behalf of society. So that's the real focus in terms of what today's work will be on, similar to what we've done in the past and will continue to do based on our theory of change. We'll approach that in what we characterize as a deep U learning experience. That deep U has three components. There's a sensing component as you move down in the U, there's a making sense at the bottom, and then as you move up the other side, there's opportunity to make decisions and choose actions in terms of changing the social system that you're trying to affect. For our sensing and making sense in these sessions, we rely on a set of provocateurs who bring their perspective in terms of what's going on inside that system, the socio-technological system in this case, and try to help participants in the session move beyond the typical blinders that we all wear to see the larger context and understand the implications of those events, those trends and driving forces that are out there that are shaping our world. And then we complement those provocateurs with an opportunity to leverage the group genius of the participants through a set of exercises that explore different aspects of the challenge that we're taking a look at. So in this case, we have we're really pleased to have 5 provocateurs with us. And just briefly, we've got Jonathan Grant from National Grid, Chris Walcott from Direct Defense, Andrew Bachman from Idaho National Labs, Mikhail Chester from Arizona State University, and Andre Restano from ISA, the International Society of Automation, who will be our provocateurs. Then within that, in the midst of their provocations, we will have these exercises. Now I'll have an opportunity to introduce each of them a little bit more fully when we get to their provocations. As we do our work, a couple notes. We will take a couple short breaks as well as a slightly longer one to pace the work as we go through the 5 hours together. The agenda is shown on the second page of the Google Doc workbook that we had sent to you. I will note that's a key part of the way that we operate these sessions is we ask people to have a dual screen up. The Zoom window in terms of being able to have the conversations together and see each other. But as well, if you can have that Google Doc workbook open, that really provides essentially a digital flip chart that we can use to record the thinking of the group, and particularly when we're in small group work, to allow the small groups to take notes on what they're observing, their conversation that they can then use to report out to the whole group. So if you can have both of those screens open, that would be very helpful. And then finally, I would note, as in the past, and I'm sure in many of your Zoom experiences now, the chat becomes a pretty rich resource to use. So if you've got notes or comments, resources that you think would be valuable for everyone to know about, or critical links or whatever, please use that as a place to provide those, or other commentary you may have about what we're up to. And as well, particularly with regard to the provocateurs, during their session, during their talks, if you have questions that you'd like to pose to the provocateurs or whatever, that's a good place to sort of put those questions in. Mike and I will try and be diligent about monitoring how that unfolds so that we can bring those questions forward appropriately. So that really is the sort of upfront logistics of what we're going to be doing. What I'd like to do is get started right away with, the group genius part of these sessions with a first exercise. In the Google Doc, if you went to page 5, just a short, or really page 6 is a more relevant page. We're going to do, what I'd like to do is do a first exercise, which asks you to really imagine the unfortunate events and consequences that could befall the critical infrastructure that we are all responsible for. So what I'd like to give you is just a few moments before we move into small groups to imagine a piece of critical infrastructure that in your practice as a member of the engineering community, from whatever seat you occupy across that community, that you are either responsible for or are dependent upon. So either case, what's a piece of critical infrastructure that you are either responsible for in some way in terms of your practice or dependent upon, both in your practice, but also in your personal life? So quickly, if you can, 30 seconds to pick out one piece of critical infrastructure? All right, so hold that thought, and then we want to talk about what we'd like you to do in small groups. We're going to give you about 15 minutes in your small group to have a conversation where you both share those in terms of which pieces of critical infrastructure popped up in your mind as you answered that prompt, but also then have you select one from your small group. So there may be 4 or 5 of you in the small group. If you can select one, and then using that one, brainstorm a set of the types of cyber threats that could fatally disrupt the operation of that particular type of critical infrastructure, or what some people would call kill threats. Select the most, and then as you do that, select the most significant of those threats, and have a short conversation about how likely the possibility of that threat actually happening is, and what impact such a threat, if it materializes, would actually have at whatever scale you want to make it. So a conversation really to do some initial thinking about what types of cyber threats are out there. So with that, we're going to put you into small groups. At this point, Mike, I think maybe 3 small groups, if we can do that. Now, in the workbook, you'll find that there is a worksheet for each of the groups. So once you're in your groups, if you can find the workbook that works for your group. When you're in your small groups, last note, please designate some small group roles. Have somebody agree to play discussion leader for for each of the exercises. Somebody to play recorder, and the recorder is working with that Google Doc workbook, and often the recorder becomes the presenter, reporting out to the whole group. And then finally, a timekeeper to pace the work once you get in there. I mean, there's cues about how long we're taking for the exercises that are embedded in the workbook. So with that, I'm going to send you off to your small groups. Again, sort of experienced people with ChangeLab, if you can help get us started with regard to those the small group exercise, we'd appreciate it. So Mike, if you want to send everyone off. Back, everyone. What I want to do is just quickly sample.
Kyle,
Yeah.
quick note.
Mike, yeah.
If you need the link to the Google Doc, it was included in the email that I sent out early this morning. So look for that if you still don't having trouble accessing that. Go ahead, Kyle.
All right, what I want to do is just quickly sample each one of the 3 groups and ask you, your presenter, what was, the piece of critical infrastructure that you ended up focusing on? What's the likelihood? I mean, what types of, threats exist with regard to that piece of infrastructure, critical infrastructure? What's the likelihood and consequence of something happening there? So if I can start with group 1, I don't know who your presenter was.
I was the note taker, I guess. Am I the presenter too? So
you're up for the presenter too. Thanks.
Here I go. Hi,
right.
everybody. We chose water, wastewater, SCADA, and I guess the threats are sort of obvious. Take over the system, right? Gain control, unauthorized access, etc. And I think we talked a little bit about some of the reasons why, chiefly among them, uncontrolled or unsecure remote access that has been set up in many cases by the SCADA configuration provider. People who commission the system. They establish remote access for continued maintenance and operation, especially when it comes to smaller municipal authorities where they don't have in-house IT. And then those smaller providers, as well as the smaller municipal authority, rarely have in-house cybersecurity expertise, so things are set up often in vulnerable ways. And even the best of them who have annual checkups, may not have the wherewithal to, really do exhaustive security audits and therefore even then they may have a false sense of security and could be left vulnerable, especially if there's a skilled attacker in waiting. I think we talked about the fact that we are chiefly responsible for this. If we're designing the system, we obviously may not have cybersecurity as a core competency, but it's our job to tag a partner and bring them in, so that whatever we turn over is turned over in a responsible way and is not open to attack. Chris mentioned there are a lot of free tools out there, lots of ways of ensuring.
let me hold you off, Marcus, in terms of how you could how we can address it. As much as right now I just want to sort of pull up what are the threats up there.
Yep, there you go, that's it.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. That's great. I mean, terrific in terms of well-intentioned but unaware sort of risks that we take on in our actions. So group 2.
Yep, so that'll be me. We talked about specifically water treatment being a what we explored further. You want me to get into that, right?
Well, you can just say, what again, maybe what was a particular aspect of the threat about water treatment, and how consequential did your group feel that would be?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, we felt the control systems behind the water treatment was the most vulnerable. There's different ways we brainstorm that people could get into those. Whether it be via software vulnerabilities, just the general interconnectivity of plants. Outsourcing of management adds a level of security issues. We felt that in general the public doesn't understand the system, and if there was an issue, creates more issues in terms of impact and the general distrust of the system. And ultimately the benefits for the hacker would be monetary ransom, just creating general terror in whatever location they're
okay, good
in.
All right, thanks. Group 3.
We mostly talked about, I guess, power, and then if you zero in, its power substations. In terms of why the threat would happen, we kind of talked about political motivations, perhaps, and power, especially because I guess most of the things we use is enabled by power, and the kind of after effects is like I guess economic costs, and yeah, I'm not sure if anyone else in the group wanted to add anything. I guess Andre, I'm not sure.
No, I think I tell you what, I think that that's a good one, and again, probably not only the economic cost, but the potential safety cost in terms of loss of power and how it could affect other parts of the community, and that are do impact public health and safety in very important ways. So, I mean, this opening exercise was really just to sort of, get our mind in the world that we're wanting to deal with here, which is, our world relies on this, this set of critical infrastructure that we put in place with the modern, with the modern world that we've created, and that has brought with it, as the digital systems and the interconnections between everything have been put in place, new risks. And that really is the context that we want to explore here. To give you even a deeper look at it, and I think a more dramatic look, we want to take advantage of an experiment that was done by Idaho National Labs a number of years ago. And Andrew Bachman, one of our provocateurs, was involved in this experiment with Idaho National Labs. But the framing for this, basically, if you can imagine, it's a cold winter morning up in Idaho in 2017. And, you know, it's a fairly secluded desert site in Idaho where a functioning bus-sized diesel generator has been located. So you've got this functioning bus-sized diesel generator located there miles away, and a designated hacker, one of the lab's cybersecurity researchers, sends about 30 lines of code from his computer through a protective relay connected to the generator. And what we want to do is watch what happens. And this is real time in terms of this video. So Mike, if you could pull up the Aurora experiment. A fairly dramatic experiment, literally real time there, that in the course of about a minute, a little over that, 30 lines of code have the level of destruction that you see with regard to that generator. And, you know, from Idaho Natural Labs perspective, it provides a textbook proof of concept for the potential of cyber-enabled sabotage of critical operational technology systems and our nation's critical infrastructure. Really, you know, how fast something significant can happen to major pieces of our critical infrastructure. And then we can begin to imagine, well, if that was part of the electrical grid, if that was part of a industrial complex, if it was part of a utility facility of some nature, what would have been the impact, both in the short term, but the long term of something like that happening. So with that framing in that context, we're going to turn to the first of our provocateurs, and that's Jonathan Grant. Jonathan is a manager of U.S. operational technology, cybersecurity at the National Grid. National Grid is a natural gas and electric energy company serving Massachusetts and New York. Jonathan also has a background in terms of consulting engineering for many years, dealing with water, wastewater type things, as well as moving over to the electrical and energy utility side more recently, with a major focus with regard to cybersecurity and cyber resilience. So with that, Jonathan, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Give me just a moment. I'll get myself set up and share screen 2. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. Thank you very much. It's really appreciate the opportunity to talk with everybody today. You know, my name is Jonathan Grant, as you mentioned. I've spent a long time, and actually I'll go to the next slide to talk about that, in operational technology, design, and now in cybersecurity. So I have a particular passion for it. As you can see, done a lot of different things. Somehow I started off in chemical engineering, ended up in control system design. So kind of a very interesting road there. One thing I wanted to mention is that, you know, and from speaking with it in my breakout group, is that my perspective is in the small to medium utility space. So, you know, that's the bias that I have, is speaking to small utilities, small municipal utilities, and things like that. I know that some of the larger facilities larger utilities might have more advanced type of controls and things along those lines, but might come from the smaller space. And so when I'm talking, that's where that's where my experience is, and kind of the work that I've done with a lot of really good people. So just want to keep that in mind while we're talking. So I'm going to set the scene for what we're talking about. Going to talk about barriers to progress that we as the engineering community potentially face as we try to move from simple cybersecurity to cyber resilience. You know, we want to get from just doing certain tasks to baking resilience in through everything that we do. And there's some barriers that we face. Also want to talk about some of the actions that we can take as an engineering community to help shift that needle from just cybersecurity and discrete actions to more of a holistic program of resilience. And then hopefully there's some takeaways that we can think about as we move into, you know, back into our positions and how we can influence everything moving forward. So setting the scene, I always find it very important to start with, we don't want to dabble in fear, uncertainty, and doubt. We don't want to. It's very easy with a topic like this to become sensationalistic. And I always want to make sure that we know that we're not talking about, you know, just trying to scare people for scaring people. It's talking about grounded threats and grounded things like that, and thinking about how we can address those. So I always bring this up is that I don't want to make it sound like I'm trying to scare anyone, because hopefully everybody here knows that we're not talking about sensationalistic things. We're talking about things that are more and more a reality to us in our daily work. So just wanted to point that out. But so wanted to start off with a hypothetical. A few years ago, I read a really good book, as you can see, by Richard Clarke called Cyber War. It's printed in, I think it was written in 2010. And Richard Clarke was part of the intelligence community through 4 presidential administrations. So he knew his way around and saw a lot of things that we may not necessarily be privy to. And so he wrote in his book, in chapter 2 specifically, on those pages that I know, he puts out a hypothetical situation that hopefully we never ever see. He talked about the systematic impact of all of those different parts of our critical infrastructure. Power, with entire cities going dark, water with, you know, no access to clean water and sewer backing up, and, you know, the chaos that creates, transportation impacting the FAA and trains and things along those lines, the finance industry, like reducing our access to cash and currency. So what would we then do? What would we be stuck doing if we had no way to just go to an ATM and get money, or even swipe a card and know that there's money there available? And shipping and logistics. What happens if shipping companies don't know where their trucks are and don't know how to schedule the deliveries, and the impact along those lines? And so he lays out what I sincerely hope is a nightmare scenario that we'll never ever have to deal with. And again, I'll show some of my age when I pull up just a random impact from the 1984 Ghostbusters movie with Peter Venkman going, cats and dogs living together, mass hysteria. And that's what Clarke tried to represent in that hypothetical scenario. And for a long time, I thought that was just, you know, again, maybe some fear, uncertainty, and doubt, getting people to think about things. And then just last month, this cybersecurity advisory was released by the Five Eyes community, which represents intelligence members from the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, who they're you know, oversight and review council, who kind of look at geopolitical factors and how it could impact, do you know what I mean, impact critical infrastructure and other intelligence. And they released this, and it talks about, if you can see the title, and I gave the document number if people want to look it up, but it describes methods utilized by a nation state to pre-position tools to be deployed later in US critical infrastructure. And so it was an attempt to open the eyes of the community to say that there is potentially that they're laying some groundwork for something that could happen in the future. Now, do we really think it is going to happen? No, but it's almost like, it's like posturing, pre-positioning, and that, you know, making note or almost like announcing that something like that could happen, maybe as a deterrent, or maybe as something that they're doing. But long story short, if you read through that, it's a fairly significant document, but it does talk about, potentially the way that something like I described before could occur. Is it going to? I'm not going to predict that, but it now seems to be more of a reality than what I thought of years ago when I read that scenario. So thinking about that, I then went to try to find some statistics on what the US OT critical infrastructure landscape looks like. And I was thinking specifically in operational technology critical infrastructure, basically that has a physical impact to the world. So I'm not necessarily thinking about the finance industry or the healthcare industry. I'm thinking more along the lines of, as some of the folks in our breakout group talked about, water, wastewater, power, manufacturing, things along those lines. Something that if you take advantage of a cyber vulnerability and impact the operation of that system, that there is a physical impact in the world, that there is people impacted or product impacted, something along those, the livelihood or the revenue of a company, if it's something along those lines. And it was a little bit shocking to me, even though I had known some of it, but it was still impressive to get that in the United States, there are nearly 50,000 water systems that cover our population, 15,000 wastewater treatment systems, 3,000 electric utilities, and an estimated number of probably pushing 300,000 manufacturing facilities. And it is huge. It is decentralized, and there's public and private, a mix of public and private infrastructure. So there's no way to really know what is being secured, how it's being secured, if it's secure at all, the risks people face, so on. So it is a daunting thought to think about how are we going to secure this? And and I say we as the engineering community, how do we contribute to the security of this landscape? And so we're all here to think about that. So I just wanted to kind of think, when we're talking about some of these things, some of the things to keep in mind as we're just kind of the landscape that we're facing. And what are some of the barriers to progress to move that needle from simple cybersecurity to true cyber resilience? And there's some obvious ones that I'm not going to mention, which are cost of that, labor, resources, to do that. Those have been very well documented, and what I'm going to be talking about will probably be documented as well. But just that there are others. I tried to focus on some of these where we might have some impact, to think about and help to mitigate, if you will. So the first one I was thinking about is, especially working in small to medium-sized utilities, is the thought process or mindset that they have. And I'm not going to read down through each one of those quotes, but I've heard all of those, and it's something that I feel as a community we need to get past, because some of these are just, there's real concern there. Like, this system is air gapped. I certainly hope nobody is saying that anymore, but it wouldn't surprise me if somebody's saying, well, we're not connected to the internet at all. And I find that to be hard to believe when they then say they're trying to pull data out. So so the mindset can be a challenge if they think they're too small, that nobody is going to target them, nothing of value to waste the time, in doing things. It's a difficult challenge, but that's the mindset of some of the, or many of maybe the utilities that people on the call, people in the discussion work with, that their focus is, being able to make sure that they're delivering the product that they need to be delivering, water or treating wastewater, things along those lines, making sure lights are on in people's homes. I've also in talking with, with clients, or with sometimes in my own organization now, they think, well, if we have a problem, we can count on the government, we can count on CISA as an organization to come and help us recover, or reach out to the FBI and they'll have resources that can come and help us, get back to where we were. And I just, hopefully we on this call know that may not necessarily be possible, because it is such a large large swath of land to cover, the entire United States. And CISA is an amazing organization, but they're limited in the resources that they have. And so we may not be able to count on that safety net of the government to come back and help us. So we're going to need to be working with our organizations or our client organizations to make sure they understand that there may not be a white knight to come in and save them in regard to the government. So we can keep that in mind. And then cyber insurance has been a topic, if you've been reading for years, whether it be in trade media or even in the mainstream media, that the cost of a policy for cyber insurance is constantly growing as they get more data and more actuary tables around the likelihood and impact and things along those lines. As they build that data, which is, the insurance company is fantastic with data, worrying about that becoming difficult to secure and maybe needing lots of security controls already in place even to qualify for a policy. So, some of the things to think about as you go forward. The other item, and actually Chris mentioned it, I think in our breakout group or maybe in the main group, is that there's not a lot of meaningful enforcement. There's a lot of excellent guidelines and frameworks. There's NIST has put out SP 800-82, which is specifically geared toward industrial control systems and how to secure them. IEC 62443 is a fantastic standard and talks about how to better secure your infrastructure. And NERC CIP, if you're in the power industry, critical infrastructure protection is what CIP stands for, that helps create a compliance baseline for securing the power grid. There's a lot of those guidelines and frameworks, but the vast majority of critical infrastructures in the United States have no requirements for operational technology cybersecurity. The CIP standards are the notable exception, but they are compliance. And hopefully everybody knows, compliance is not cybersecurity, but at least creates a floor for security and helps improve the defensiveness of the power grid and things along those lines. But other infrastructure sectors do not. The American Water Infrastructure Act seemed like it was going to have some teeth, and the EPA was tabbed to enforce some of those regulations, but then they called off enforcement in the water sector. I hope it gets picked up again in the near future, but it's, there's no enforcement. And without enforcement, it's easy to put it to the side and say, I'll get to it when I can and deal with maybe a more pressing operational task, replacing a pump and making sure that our capacity is what it should be. But if that always gets shuffled to the back of the line, it may not be there when it's needed and when an event really occurs. So sometimes enforcement brings about, it's not just a problem to try to meet, but it also brings forth hopefully meaningful change. So what can we do as an engineering community what actions can we take and how can we help move forward and get to that ideal position of resilience rather than just security, or even starting to get to security? If we don't even want to go all the way to resilience to start, take small steps and get to just considering cybersecurity. We need to change the hearts and minds of our organizations, or in the case of consultants, our clients. We need to educating organizations and the decision makers on the impact of cyber events. Hopefully that is becoming less as they become more obvious and more in the public eye, but still need to make sure that they understand the impact. Even if they're a small organization or a small utility, how long could they run without automation if something happened and all their backups are lost and they need to run in manual for 2 to 3 weeks? Do they have the resources to do that? And make sure that they're thinking of that when they're determining how to spend their budget and how to put controls in place to protect themselves. Make sure that risk mitigation is considered in budgeting and continually considered in budgeting. As hopefully we're all here, we know that security is a journey and not a destination. It's not a one-stop, okay, we're going to put in these controls, we're going to install this cybersecurity tool or something like that, and we're perfectly secure. It involves, that takes time, it takes constant vigilance, it takes tuning, it takes, reevaluation and, changing as the landscape itself changes. So to make sure that they understand, kind of combining those two bullets is that it's always in the budgeting process so that there are at least some resources available to mitigate the risks, but also understand that it's not a one-off, that we'll be talking about this each year, each quarter, to make sure that we're doing what's necessary for our organizations or for our clients. I thought about this one quite a bit, is that and the vendors that I show over here on the right are just a representative sample of of the vendors that work in the automation space and critical infrastructure automation. And this is not intended to point at any of them. It just wanted to be a representative sample, is that we in the engineering community, we have an opportunity to use our influence to change the mindset of these organizations, to do some more careful consideration in baking in security controls in their systems. For a long time, they've operated and they've done a fantastic job of creating very available, robust, long-lasting equipment. But security has been either a non-factor or very low in their consideration. As we know, as operational technology becomes more and more of a target to bad actors, malicious actors, we have to think more about having security in the equipment itself and not relying on compensating controls and to protect the systems that are so important to the organizations, to ourselves. The analogy that I like to use, and I hope it's a pretty simple one, is that if you look at an operational technology system, most likely it's going to seem like an M&M. It's got the hard candy shell with controls around it to try to protect the system. But if you're able to get through that hard candy shell, there's a soft GUI center. And there's not a lot of control in there, not a lot of security controls to protect the system inside. We'd like to be able to change that paradigm so that it's once you get through the outer perimeter, there are controls inside as well to help protect the operation. So this, and I think we can work with our vendors to make that more of a priority if we all speak to them when we have the opportunity of talking product roadmap sessions and things along those lines. And
so Jonathan, you've got 2 or 3 more minutes.
I will be right there. I'm actually wrapping it up. Thank you for the time check. For our own standard of care in our community is to make sure that every discipline has a basic cybersecurity knowledge. And one of our provocateurs, Mikhail, in his pre-reading mentioned that. I thought it was great, is make sure that we all have an idea of the landscape so we can look at our own individual disciplines and see if we can make changes to make it more secure. Yet another provocateur, Andy Bachman, was part of the authorship of the CCE framework, the consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering framework to build cybersecurity, the thought process, so that it's not all just digital, it is built into the process itself. We could utilize that more in our processes. And last, let's not just think about the processes and making them work, let's also make them work securely and consider that defense in depth so that we're baking in security at every level of the process, not just at the very end or on the outside at the perimeter. So hopefully here's some takeaways that we can consider as we move forward today and as we go back out into our regular roles, is that U.S. OT critical infrastructure is particularly vulnerable because we are large and decentralized, public-private amalgam that makes our nation work. And that's one of the strengths, but it also can be a challenge for us to protect. But we as a community do have an opportunity to make meaningful change. As long as we don't try to boil the ocean and make small steps that add to the greater whole, maybe through some of the suggestions that I had or those of your own, to be able to move this needle and get us to more cyber resilience and not just discrete cybersecurity tasks. But anyway, and that's where I am. Thank you all very much for the time. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to talk about them. But I really do appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. And just that, one or two questions, if you have them, before we move to a break. Always a little bit tough to do on Zoom screens. Easier to field these and to generate them when you're in whole group or when you're in person. All right. Well, with that, you can continue to think about that. As I say, if you do have questions come up for any of our provocateurs as we go through, if you want to use the chat to record those, and we'll try and come to them later, or at least have them available to us to field after the session and see if we can communicate in another means about them. With that, I want to take just a short 5-minute break. Refill a coffee cup or run down the hall, and then we'll come back and move into our second exercise. So thank you, Jonathan, for that good start with your provocation, and we'll see everybody. On my clock, it's 11:05 Central, so we'll reconvene at 11:10, please. Thank you. Proceed. And we'll allow the others to catch up as they come back from the break. Let me introduce, what we want to do is move from, the first of our provocations into our second exercise and begin to really explore one aspect of the change that needs to happen. And Jonathan in his talk talked about, one of the barriers that we're facing if we want to really move from, where we are today to a cyber-secure, cyber-resilient future with regard to critical infrastructure is the need to change thought processes or mindsets in people. And it really speaks to changing culture within the context of particularly the engineering community as a whole, or within the context of your firm or the asset owners engineering organization. Is there's that need to change mindsets, to change the culture. But in order to do that, we need to understand where are we starting from with regard to culture. And culture can often be characterized as the stories we tell ourselves about how we do things around here. And so that's what we want to explore next, is what's the story or the narrative that we tell ourselves within the engineering community about the current state of engineering and cybersecurity. What's the story we tell ourselves? And so in this exercise, we'll put you into small groups again, and there's a couple prompts that we'll ask you to explore in your discussion. The first is, what is the old or current narrative that members of the engineering community have told themselves about just that, engineering and cybersecurity? So explore the culture from that lens of cybersecurity, given what has happened with regard to technology over the last 30 years. What's the story we tell ourselves? Then the second prompt is, how confident are you that the cyber defenses at the heart of that narrative are working for the critical infrastructure that you or your organization are responsible for, or that are engaged in some manner? So, what's your degree of confidence that, this is going to work versus, what the threats might be? So 2 pieces of conversation there. Overall, when you get in your small groups, we'll ask you again to quickly introduce yourself, designate some roles there. You can combine the recorder presenter. I think that works pretty well. And then overall, let's take 17 minutes to do that small group work, a couple minutes to introduce yourselves and get those roles, and about 15 minutes in discussion. I'd say probably the heart of the discussion in the first of those 2 bullets, and then the second piece of it on the second bullet. Come prepared to report out to the whole group just 1 or 2 key insights about each of those questions that showed up in your conversation. We won't have you report out everything, but 1 or 2 key insights as you reflected on both of those prompts. Any questions? What I'm asking
Kyle,
you to do?
there's a question in the chat about the second prompt.
Yes. You read it. It says, could you please explain a bit more on the second prompt? How confident are you? Well, there, I mean, I really want to get at, your particular perspective, or the perspective that you see around you in your organization, with people in your organization. Just that about, have we done a good job? Are we confident that the type of that the engineering that we're doing on behalf of clients, or if we're inside an asset owner, how confident are we that we're doing the right things and that it's secure? Or are we feeling at risk in some of the ways perhaps that Jonathan articulated or pointed to, or that we saw in that Aurora experiment? So it's just a sense of, do you share that uneasiness, or are you okay? And if you're okay, how does that fit with regard to what the reality might be out there? Okay, hopefully that gives you some guidance there. We'll move you into your small groups. Mike, if you can set it for 17 minutes. Again, I'll move around the different groups as we go through, and we'll see you in just a few minutes. Thanks for good, just sampling the three groups. Good discussion going on there. What I'd like to do is have each group report out a couple different things. One, how did you describe? How did your group describe that current narrative, or particularly what was one key aspect or attribute or attitude that is really sort of present in the culture of the engineering community about cybersecurity? So just one aspect of your conversation about that bullet point. And then the second, again, what was your sense of gauge the overall confidence in the cybersecurity space with regard to the practice of engineering? So with that, I just start with group one. I don't know who your presenter is. And group one was Stephen, Charles, Warren, Nancy, Ben, Daviani, and John.
I'll step in. I can.
Thank you.
Anybody else? But the general is the current narrative we talked about was, there's limited resources to address cybersecurity, especially in the small to medium-sized utilities. So we talked about the challenges of attempting to make meaningful change when what limited resources there are often deviated to other like pressing operational needs. We talked about that, and that's a big concern. And from how confident were we, the general scope of our conversation was that we were not terribly confident, and that that we had some interesting point of trying to make sure that all of the engineering disciplines had a better idea of the impact of cybersecurity on what they were doing, so that maybe, again, kind of like foreshadowing some of the other conversations, is that could there be things that were done in the design process, not necessarily maybe in cybersecurity, but in process design and things like that, that could alleviate the impact of a cybersecurity type event to, manipulate processes and things like that. So not always relying on the digital solution, but maybe there's other things we could do down the line. So that's kind of like some of the things that we had discussed in our group.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. And group two?
I'll speak for group two. So
Thanks.
I think, the primary concern, or one of the concerns that came up early on, is that a general feeling that engineers understand some of these issues and they talk about them, but there isn't follow-on action from there. They're uncertain about where the responsibility lies, where they need to push the conversation from, okay, we know that this might be a problem, to we need to do something about it, or even how to do something about it and where to start. And I think that the overall feeling was that there's not a high level of confidence. And then the discussion went to whether or not that's based on a lack of regulation, sort of regulation versus best practice to drive that forward. And what that means for resilience and responsibility for, specifically design engineers.
All right, thanks. And group 3?
Yeah, let me scroll back. The document moves around when there's multiple people in it. So the narrative,
Thanks, Marcus.
or series of narratives, was along the lines of it's an IT problem. We're just the designers. Let's leave it to the experts. Another common comment is, why would we be a target? What we're doing isn't terribly interesting or exciting. We'll just hire a consultant, we'll outsource it. And I think, aside from all that, we talked about that there's generally a lack of familiarity amongst not only the customer or our clients, but even in the engineering community, a lack of understanding or familiarity with the importance of cybersecurity, and also a lack of understanding of the complexity of the systems that we design and support.
Great. And so that your discussion about confidence then led you where?
Let's see, how confident are we? I guess, at least in our group, it seemed like there's oh, there it went, it just moved again. There's some notion of this being still sort of potshot attempts, and I'd say this is probably prevalent. We're still not seeing ourselves as high value targets. We have to look at vulnerabilities at a local level. So I'd say there's sort of a C- level of confidence, and yeah.
Particularly, it sounds like, given that you don't, the group's sense was that particularly with small, medium size, well, we're not a target, so we'll have confidence in not being, the place that bad actors would necessarily focus on. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I would say so, but I think we also, and this is why there's a community out there who are being brought into these projects. We know that window is closing. I mean, at some point, we're going to be more of a target, and as the as one market closes, right? To the extent that one sector of the business world hardens itself, then the bad actors are left with no choice but to look elsewhere, right? And they're going to say, well, now we're going to go attack some middle schools and some water authorities and squeeze some money out of them. So I think it's really just a function of understanding that nobody's immune, nobody's fully protected, and eventually your time will come too.
Okay.
Hey, Kyle, another aspect of it that we kind of talked about in the group was because of the way our country, the individual states, and we have local municipalities, and we have all these separate systems that are, managed and controlled separately and all that stuff, that it would be harder for maybe somebody to cause a mass problem, right? Because these systems aren't interconnected, because they're all owned by different entities and that kind of operated differently, that kind of thing. So maybe our confidence level went way down, but then we're like, well, but maybe the attack maybe wouldn't be so bad because it would only impact a small group, or that kind of thing.
We're incredibly fragmented, and that will save us.
Sounds like we have a never-ending ability to rationalize our vulnerabilities and in order to feel better about the situation. Okay, so let's take, given those observations, both about, what's, what's the current story told about, these risks and vulnerabilities, and how that looks from an engineering community perspective, the degree of confidence there. It really sets up, I think, great perspectives and great work being done by you know, a number of leaders inside leaders individually and organizationally with regard to trying to accomplish some of what you just noted in terms of what has to happen with the engineering community in order for the engineering community to step up much more fully into both awareness but also action with regard to affecting the vulnerabilities that we have and moving towards cyber resilience. So we want to start with our go to our next two provocateurs. The first of them, Chris Walcott, from Direct Defense. He is, you know, Chris has a, you know, a background in terms of cybersecurity as a consultant and, as noted, an evangelist with regard to cybersecurity and cyber resilience. He has experience both with utilities, with consulting organizations, or inside engineering consulting organizations, but also then with Direct Defense, directly involved in these types of issues as a consultant to other organizations. And so with that, Chris, I'll turn it over to you, your perspective.
Thank you. I'm going to share my slides here. Okay. All right. Briefly on me, 25 years in IT and cybersecurity. Started on the IT help desk with Constellation Energy, which was the parent company of Baltimore Gas and Electric. Notable things for them: 37 power plants, 3 nuclear facilities. One of the very first early adopters of advanced metering infrastructure, AMI, AMR 2003. Bulk electric system upgrade not long after that, that basically was one of the reasons the blackout in the Northeast didn't continue further south, because that state-of-the-art system had just been upgraded and had a more resilient capability to kind of stop the flow of that blackout when it came through. I went from there to SunGuard, running threat and vulnerability management. So I've handled close to 1,000 breaches in my career at this point. Went from there to Black & Veatch, helped run their security risk and compliance practice for 7 years and was the deputy CISO internally. And then I've been with Direct Defense for about 6 years. So heavy critical infrastructure manufacturing, early critical infrastructure hacker before it really was established practices for a lot of firms. Do a lot of work with engineering firms. So I've been involved with ECL since very early on. Do a lot of webinars for ACEC over the years, and a few other organizations, AECIT, and a few others that are specifically focused on helping engineering firms understand these challenges. And there's a couple of my clients here on the call today. A lot of work in battery storage and smart cities. We'll talk a little bit about 62443 and ISA. I don't want to get too far into that because there's another provocateur who's focused around it. But involved in the NERC SIP committees, been a vice chair and on several committees there. Was involved in the American Waterworks Association's rewrite of their J100 standard, which is basically a framework for OEA. The SIA Utility Advisory Board, and then speaker at RSA and Black Hat and all that sort of fun stuff. So why do engineers care about cybersecurity? Well, one of the things that I get asked from time to time is if I were going to attack critical infrastructure in this country, where would I start? And because of the privatized nature of most of our utilities, it wouldn't be a simple thing to attack any one utility and have that cascade across the large region. Even if you have organizations that are merchant energy focused or large water focused, I know San Jose Water owns water utilities across a pretty good stretch. Those organizations a lot of times acquire. And so what that means is you have different brands, different versions, different flavors of the control systems all over the place. So even if you have one company that's controlling multiple utilities, a lot of times they're not going to have the same infrastructure from region to region. So you're not going to be able to find that one magic vulnerability or that one password that gets published on the internet and utilize that to compromise a whole organization. What we do need is for engineers to understand what are the design considerations, what are the types of questions they should be asking, and where, when you're looking at design build for new infrastructure or replacement of old infrastructure, that comes into play. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about a reference project. We'll pick on Hudson Yards a little bit later here. But specifically, what are the types of things that engineers should know. Where do they need to have some thoughts in the back of their head? You don't need to be a cyber SME. You don't need to be the person who's going to solve the problem, but you do need to know some of the basic questions to ask. And a lot of times, I think that was borne out by that second group discussion that we had. The engineers in the room said these discussions happen, but that nothing goes any further. And so is that because people don't know the right questions to ask, or they don't feel like it's their responsibility? I would love to see the engineering disciplines move partly through education and, universities and training and apprenticeships and the other programs that exist, and partly through culture change in the existing engineering organizations towards a concept of, I want it to be my responsibility to at least have that discussion, to make sure that we're aware that there are considerations almost no matter what infrastructure you're building. Even if you're building a highway, if there's automatic toll road capability, if they're tracking traffic patterns, if they're putting cameras up, there's sensors, anytime you've got any of that automation, there's a consideration for where is that data going to go? How is it going to be protected? So most of the US doesn't have the kind of privacy laws that dig into that. But if you look at GDPR in Europe, which California has copied with the CCPA, their Privacy Act, there are concerns over where where data is stored, and it can get as granular as you've got a camera that's watching a highway, you now have people's license plates, and you can track their patterns of where they go. So just having the thought process to think through some of that and know where to start the discussion is where sort of my evangelism has taken me over the past few years in this space. So in order to get there, what sorts of things do engineers need to be thinking about? So first is, what's the critical function for whatever it is that's being designed or built? What's the criticality matrix? Do you have one core function that this thing, whether it's a building, whether it's a highway, whether it's a water system, a power plant, a substation, a smart city, whatever that may be, what are the key areas that project can't function without that are technology enabled? And what drivers are there that would make somebody want to try to impact that and take that system down? From there, you have to look at any additional compliance requirements that may exist. So one of the reasons I picked on Hudson Yards is because they have their own power generation, cogeneration facility, which means they're now generating power to run part of that community, but then they're also tied into the bulk electric system. And so even though they're SIP low because of where they sit and what they do, they've got some requirements they have to deal with. The next is a focus around the structure of continuity of operations for these projects. So when you do a resilience study or design failure or a threat matrix or whatever the models are, risk assessment, make sure that there is, when you start to talk about continuity of operations of the project, a consideration for how cybersecurity impacts that. And like I said, you don't need to be the expert, but you should know a few of the questions to ask. What happens if this particular system goes away? And in the back of your head, you're thinking ransomware, but you don't have to go that far with it. You don't have to say, what happens if it gets hit with ransomware? What ransomware does, it makes that system unavailable for a period of time, in addition to losing data, but that's a different discussion that's not relevant here. What happens if that system goes away? And so that's part of the cyber risk discussion, because the hackers can take that system away just as easily as a hurricane could. So make sure that that's part of the thought process. The next, and this isn't always true, but I throw it out there as a provocation, right? On-premise isn't really a thing anymore. If you're in a bulk electric system, if you're in the power grid, NERC doesn't permit cloud-based architecture, but every other critical infrastructure discipline, whether it's water, whether it's drinking water, whether it's wastewater, whether it's telecommunications and rail, whether it's, ships, oil and gas pipeline, all of those systems are starting to push data into the cloud. And that's partly because of the cost of that business, but it's also because some of the software vendors are starting to push for that model. And if there isn't a regulation which says you can't do it, and it's going to be cheaper and more resilient for the overall system, when I say overall system, I mean the system storing the data, then why not do it? But the downside is you have to get that data from inside whatever security perimeter you've established for your operational systems out to wherever it's going to sit in the cloud. There's a lot of ways to do that, but there aren't many right ways to do it. And then the last thing here is, where are you going to have unexpected ties to other critical infrastructure? So once again, Hudson Yards has a cogeneration plant. That power plant isn't just providing power to the grid for that particular development. It's also doing heat recovery, steam generation, water collection. It's the first LEED Gold certified community in Manhattan. There's other pieces that tie in. They tie into water and wastewater systems. There's a train station in the basement of one of the buildings. They tie into the subway system. So understanding where the other interplays happen, and that's before you get into the commercialization of the OT side of that infrastructure and what the developers are trying to do to generate additional revenue for themselves. So if you are aware of the commercialization side, let's say you're working in a development like that one, then you do need to at least ask some of the questions about how else that data is going to be used. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So this project, well, let's start with the basics. So they took 28 acres over the open rail yards, roughly 30th Street, and they built a 35,000-ton platform. So 300 pillars roughly to support this. These buildings are sitting on top of a platform that's anywhere from 12 to 27 feet elevated above the rail yard. So amazing engineering feat, great use of space where there wasn't any additional space in Manhattan. They had talked about using it for the Olympics, but they didn't win that bid. So when they did this, they took on a model of each building, each tower having its own set of investors. Now, where that's problematic is that means there's no continuity of systems. And I've been in some of these buildings and I've worked with Related, which is one of the developers. These structures are almost autonomous in how they were designed and built. So you'll have a different elevator system in each one. You have different security cameras, different badge access, just different overall infrastructure. And then what they've done is they've taken this and they said, okay, we expect it's going to have this much of a requirement for power load. So they built a 13.3 megawatt cogeneration facility with that steam recovery I was talking about, and some of the other capabilities. Now, 16 structures, 4 million square feet of retail space, 4,000 residences. And one of the first organizations that got involved was Sidewalk Labs. Now, Sidewalk Labs is part of Alphabet, sort of the Google family of companies, and they were looking at how they could implement different types of technology to make the space more livable and more useful. One of the first things that they did is they put these kiosks all over the place. They're signboards, and the top of them are full of infrastructure. They've got cameras, they've got wireless, they've got near field communications, which is like sort of badge reader technology. They've got Bluetooth beaconing turned on. They built their own mobile application. So what that means is that when you enter the space, instantly you're tied into facial recognition. And that's one of the only private entities in the US that has a tie between their facial recognition and the FBI and local law enforcement and Homeland Security. So if you're a known wanted international terrorist, it's not a place you want to go because the police will be aware fairly quickly that you're there. But for those concerned about their own personal privacy, you can see where that is potentially problematic. The next thing is if you have Bluetooth turned on your phone, that Bluetooth is going to see the beacons from these devices. And if you've just been Google searching for food and there's a restaurant in the retail space of that type, you're going to get a pop-up ad for that restaurant. If you walk into one of the residence towers and you live there, the facial recognition is going to see you. It's going to permit you into the space. It's going to automatically call an elevator dispatched to your floor. If you have the app and it sees that you have a restaurant reservation for later that night, it's going to ask you if you want some wine out of the cellar. It's going to ask if you have a restaurant reservation someplace else, whether or not you need a car called, or whether or not you need your car brought up from the garage. So this is what I'm talking about when I talk about understanding what the project is and understanding how the data may be used. So these design specifications, those kiosks and the Bluetooth and the wireless and the dispatch elevators, all of those things are different entry points for a potential threat actor, the bad guy. And you knowing enough to ask some of the questions to say, how is this going to be secured? Or what are we doing to limit the scope of use of that data is something that should be in an engineer's mind from my perspective. Either that or know that you need help and pull in somebody who has that knowledge. But understanding the interconnectivity, they've got their own energy control center. They run the power plant based on the spot price, real-time spot price of natural gas. So if natural gas is cheap enough, they run the power plant. If it's cheaper to buy it off the grid, they buy it off the grid. But then the local reliability coordinator in the power grid may say we need that extra generation. Manhattan's a weird space from that perspective. There's no power generation really inside Manhattan proper, except for this power plant that I'm aware of. And then they've got these transmission lines that run under the rivers on both sides. So constrained usage is a problem. There isn't really a way to get more electricity onto the island.
So Chris, this is your 5-minute time check.
Yep, thank you. So what does that mean from a changing threat landscape? Well, security attacks get more sophisticated each year. You know, maybe I don't need remote access if I have the ability to get a drone into the space. What could I do with a drone? Well, let's say I put a GPS transmitter on the drone and I managed to get it up over that power plant's substation, right? And I can change the GPS clock, which throws things out of time sync. Critical infrastructure, especially in the energy sector, really doesn't like that. It tends to knock things offline for safety reasons. So understanding how some of that comes into play, you know, and maybe that's resilient design, secure design, so that that's a contained facility and you can't see what it is from the outside. Or maybe the design considerations would make it very difficult to get a drone close enough to do something like that. But understanding what some of the risks are and where those concerns play into things, I think, is part of the discussion. So what am I going to say to a room full of engineers? Know what you don't know. Know what the questions are that you need to ask. Understand what smart infrastructure really is. So what is a smart city? 9 times out of 10, it's an energy company that has put in smart grid, smart metering, and now they have this wireless infrastructure and they want to share the cost. So they go to the city and say, hey, we'd like to license some of this wireless infrastructure and let you use it and let your parking meter vendors or your parking garage vendors or your street light control vendors or even emergency operations for police and fire and EMT utilize that infrastructure. But if you're that system owner, you're now going to potentially introduce other entities into that organization. It's your ecosystem. You need to have control of that ecosystem and understand whether what you're allowing is a beneficial bacteria or a bad virus. Push for action on discussions. If you're having these discussions and then it comes time to move forward with, let's say, an RFP or something like that, and the discussions just sort of stop happening and go away, be the person to bring it up and say, you know what, we talked about these things. What do we need to do? Let's have a plan to take an action. And then look at your RFP requirements, particularly if you're in the EPC space and you're the engineering design side. Understand where you can make a difference. Put those IEC 62443 ISA 99 requirements in the RFP. Make sure that you've got systems that have resilience testing, or you've got a design infrastructure plan to have everything security tested when it's put in place before it goes live. These are things you can directly impact. How do you avoid vendor transmitted diseases, VTDs? Making sure that the vendors that are that one always gets a laugh. I'm working on trademarking that term because I kind of came up with it and use it a lot. But if you're going to allow a vendor remote access and you need to for whatever reason, make sure that your contractual language And the conversations that happen require that you know that they are secure and they're not going to be the source of the problem. Nobody can ever tell me the name of the air conditioning vendor that got Target breached. They didn't get breached directly. They got breached through a third party. So make sure that if you are making specific design choices, that those choices happen with a sense towards cybersecurity and making sure that they share that same posture. If you are going to have tabletop exercises to test cyber resilience, include any vendors that have third-party access. Ask them to take part so you understand their stance on how they would, let's say, report. If they themselves got breached, would they report to you? Is that part of their process? The system owners and integrators are at risk. The information sharing mechanisms are at risk. The people, process, and technology. These are all organizations on the left that were breached through third parties. There's been more since then. I haven't updated this in a while, this particular one. But these are the types of discussions, like I said, if I was going to attack critical infrastructure in this company, who would I attack? I would go after the engineering firms. You've got the design plans. You're the integrators. Sometimes you have people writing custom code. You're the ones that generally might have some level of remote access. If I could get into a large engineering firm of the right type, I may be able to get the data I need for 100 water utilities or 200 electric utilities or all the smart infrastructure in a city. So that is where I will stop.
Thanks, Chris. Next, I want to move to our next provocateur in this space of, beginning to, think about how do we go from where we currently are, that current narrative, to where we need to be, given what is, evolving on the technology side, and the role the engineering community should be playing with respect to that. So our next, provocateur, Andrew Bachman. He's a senior grid strategist and infrastructure defender with Idaho National Labs. Really has been centrally involved with regard to the work and the research that Idaho National Labs has been doing about this topic. So sort of one of the centers that the federal government has identified in terms of doing research and offering advice, guidance, perspective about how we as a country need to address these vulnerabilities, and included, that was a setting for that Aurora experiment that we started with, and Andrew might comment on that. He has been a previous provocateur for the Change Lab last year, so we're pleased to have him back. He was the co-author of one of the readings that we recommended in terms of coming, prior to coming to the session, the book Countering Cyber Sabotage, Introducing Consequence-Driven Cyber-Informed Engineering, which Jonathan referred to a little bit ago. So with that, Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kyle. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that's a good start. I just have a couple slides, and I'll switch to those in a second. I want to say appreciation for Mike and Kyle for having this platform to bring all these great people together. I'm in 2 meetings right now at the same time, but I was able to catch part of John's as well as Chris's talks, and I thought they were excellent. I hope they were good for the engineering audience too. I imagine they were pretty decent in that respect. What I'm going to do is going to be different, of course. It's going to be a story. And let's see if I can make it be something that you can see okay. I have to make it bigger. Let me know if, do you see a full screen now of a slide?
Yes.
Okay, head nods and the verbal. All right, great. All right, so I'm going to tell you a story that is, what should we say? It's based on a true story, but the names have been changed. And so just sit back and relax. There'll be a couple slides that support it, but it's mainly about listening to the narrative and trying to imagine yourself in it or near it. Okay, so it goes like this. A small independent municipal water utility we'll call them SimWoo, would like to invest in cloud services to allow them to remotely monitor and control their 6 pumping stations. Oh, wait, first, there's me. Okay, and then there's this, and then there's this. Okay, back on track. They've been approached by a cloud service provider, and they're saying we can help you monitor and control your distributed assets for a reasonable fee, and that will just be wonderful for you. And that's super exciting to this company because it means they no longer have to just be 2 folks in a truck managing all their different stations. They'll be able to put their energy into proactively managing their business instead of reacting all the time. And there's companies, not just in water, of course, but all over the country, all over the world, that are being shown this opportunity by various vendors and are considering it, if not acting on it. Well, okay, so they know enough to come to ECL, that's you guys, ECL's recently formed consulting arm for insights and guidance about this opportunity. And so here's how part of the conversation goes. SimWoo says to ECL, hey, we're getting ready to make this giant, at least giant for us, investment in the cloud. Can you spend a few minutes on the cybersecurity questions and concerns we should have? And the ECL consultants respond, okay, first off, there's the cyber maturity of your vendor partner on this. The big guys, Amazon Web Services, Azure, from Microsoft, Google Cloud, they don't provide much detail about their security practices. So depending on who you go with, their service will likely ride on top of one of those or someone else similar. That's an area you should definitely explore. There are some well-respected cyber researchers covering that space, and we'll be happy to connect you. The other thing we can do is apply cyber-informed engineering principles to your current system design so that you can understand the potential amount of cyber risk you'll be taking on and what might be done to mitigate it. SimWoo was interested and open-minded about this, and so the conversation began. The first area of exploration was on what were the critical consequences that an adversary could cause through cloud-based remote control. I should pause with an aside here because I heard this in the previous talks. This utility is relatively forward-leaning for a small water utility. They're not saying any of the things like, oh, the government will protect us, or we're too small, who would want to attack us, or insurance will cover it. These guys are around and aware in the years 2024, and they're like, hey, of course, we're living in a cyber contested space, and we're very reliant on digital things. So tell us more, ECL. Okay, that was my little sidebar. I hadn't planned on that, but I see how that fits into the other provocations. Okay, so ECL said, start with the worst case assumption. All of the cloud vendors' cybersecurity controls have failed to keep the adversary out. It's a bad day for the vendor side, as well as for their very many customers, like you guys. Well, let's just assume that happened. Okay, determining possible operational consequences. In this case, the adversary could turn the pump on and off. Oh, so anyway, here's your cloud-based monitoring and control. You can see I'm not really adept at always remembering to turn the slides. This is kind of a visual of what it would look like, the view from above and around by digital means. So the adversary could turn a pump on and off. Is this something that would be catastrophic for you, the asset owner? ECL asks. And SimWoo thought about it and said, well, you know, it means 2 folks in a truck. It means 2 hours in traffic. It means that for that pumping station, we might need to disconnect from the control, cloud control, and then move it back to manual control. That would be an annoying day, but certainly not a catastrophic day for us. Okay, so ECL is going to press a little bit further because that's the point of this exercise. And so ECL says, okay, so let's keep thinking. And the one idea that we have might be potentially catastrophic for an asset owner like SimWoo was that if an adversary turned a pump on and off repeatedly and rapidly, so fast that they damage the pump by overheating it and damaging windings and other internal components, this would be an Aurora type situation for those of you now schooled on Aurora, driving a piece of equipment through digital means to destructions, to self-destruct. That would mean that you now would have an engineering project on your hands. You'd have to procure a new pump. and you'd have to replace it even if you had one on the shelf. We imagine this is perhaps a month's worth of outage and workarounds while you perform that fix. This was clearly not something Simwu thought that they could do overnight. So they agreed. Yeah, that would be a catastrophic day at the municipality level, they said. And ECL continued. But beyond that, what if they burned out all 6 of your pumps in the same attack? There was no response from Simwu leadership to that one beyond the color draining from their faces. All right, here we go. CIE and engineering first principles to the rescue. So ECL starts with, okay, so now let's get an engineer in the room. And let's think about what controls the engineering department has that would keep somebody from being able to create those worst case consequences. Simwu engineer Ray says, maybe a solution, this is an older guy, I'm stereotyping him. Maybe a solution involves using something that has been with us for a long time, a time delay relay. It's a timer where if I give a command, it flows the command through it and immediately starts the timer, and then it does not open for another command again until the timer runs out. Certainly we can get digital versions of this, but there are also electromechanical versions as well. Though from what I know, they've been mainly replaced by digital ones to save time and money. Yes, the price of convenience by going digital. But anyway, there are electromechanical ones on the market. So that's kind of what happened. And this is the epilogue. A workable solution and the best of both worlds. Here's how it played out. Simwu procured electromechanical time delay relays and put them in every pump motor controller and then set them to a 20-minute interval. That means that the utility office is now slightly constrained. They can turn a pump on or off, but then they have a 20-minute waiting period and they can't pump water during that time if they turned it off. And they have to adapt to that process change. But it also means that an adversary, no matter how fast they send commands, they're only going to get one through every 20 minutes. And with that, they won't be able to damage equipment, the pump or its motor. They might create headaches, but then again, it's the old 2 folks in a truck as before. After temporarily removing the pumping station from the automatic control monitoring, they're back to where they need to be. As is often the case with CIE, it can be remarkably affordable for a so-called security solution. Time delay relays cost about $20 a pop, and they take maybe half a day's work to install. No matter how good the adversary is, unless they are hiring people to physically break into pump stations, they can't subvert this physical protection. Now, operational cyber risk is limited and certainly no longer the worst case level of consequence by preventing key equipment destruction. Adding engineering physical controls completely changes the downstream risk envelope. Last part. We have a statement from the Simwu CEO named Sally. She says, looks like we get to have our cake and eat it too. While there's a cost for putting in these time delay relays, the dual win is that we get the benefits of cloud monitoring and control without having to live with the fear of catastrophic cyber risk. In fact, the CIE solution is what enables us to take advantage of these great cloud capabilities. I couldn't be happier. Thanks, ECL. And that is the end of the story. And I think, as I've heard from other provocations, this point, Kyle or Mike does anybody want to say anything?
Actually, Mike, or actually, Andrew, I do want to ask you a question, and it's embedded in the story that you've told, which is if in fact they would have been able to burn out all 6 generators, or all 6 pumps, excuse me,
yeah,
and cause that level. One of the themes that developed in your book that I want to refer to was the sense that, through cyber-informed engineering and that approach to these problems, that you need to bring cybersecurity to the same level of acceptance and practice as safety. Accomplishing that would have an immense effect on both the organization and our country's defensive security problems. Can you comment about that notion of, you know, bringing cybersecurity up to the same level as safety from an ethic, from a engineering perspective?
Yeah, and ultimately, hopefully, from a regulation, compliance, and standards perspective too, which is something that we're working on. The engineering standard of care for cybersecurity matters. So, yeah, I guess the reason that folks at INL and elsewhere, and I'm sure the other provocateurs think this way to some extent, is that safety too is something that didn't used to exist in our country. It wasn't required, and when it first started to come along, and OSHA has developed old guard crusty folks are like, what, you want us to be safe and build a building at the same time? Just forget it. It's regulation and bureaucracy. Ultimately, the culture change did happen through carrots and sticks, and safety did become this preeminent value and virtue that folks in DOE and all manner of industrial spaces adhere to. Cybersecurity, though, when it came on the block, it was the same type of thing. What, you want us to like work, but do that too? It's getting in the way of everything. It's the Department of No. And as long as it was this sort of esoteric, abstract IT related issue, maybe privacy related, maybe money related, we were still able to push off on it. But as you get into the cyber physical space, synonymously OT cyber, industrial control cyber, you get to the realization that folks doing this on keyboards in distant places can create physical consequences which have profound safety ramifications, both to people in the industrial zone, in a manufacturer, in a water utility, an electric company, but also to their downstream customers, like people that use electricity and water, for example. So that's the origin statement or that's the origin of thinking about making that comparison. And I think it's happening, but maybe like safety, it's the work of a generation or so before it becomes as inculcated as broadly as we hope it does.
Great, thank you for that. I do think that was, you know, particularly, you know, reading your book and sort of the other readings that we've had, Mikhail's article and things. That piece in terms of how do we take the engineering community on that same journey that they went on for safety with regard to cybersecurity, I think is, you know, allows us to sort of see, you know, what the future may hold in terms of where the engineering community has to go from that perspective.
Sure, Scott.
And okay, so any other questions before we move to our second break, or for either Chris or Andrew?
Just a comment from.
Yes, thanks, Andre.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at this topic area of safety. You know, we've been on this journey for 50 years now, and it's a culture change and a lot of information to exchange. And I looked at the cybersecurity and its nexus to safety, but in today's world, information exchange is about 1,000 times faster. I mean, all the knowledge that you need to know about this topic area is available on your computer screen right now today for everybody. And the question is, well, if it's all there, why isn't it happening yet? And so we don't have OSHA. We don't have regulation. I think, you know, like I said before, I'm not a big government guy, but I think the government has to tell us to fix it, make it a law, but not be prescriptive and tell us how. But I think until that happens, it's not going to be, there's not going to be a for real initiative other than on the procurement side or insurance regulations.
All right, great, good comment, and we'll hear more from Andre, you know, later on in our program. So, with that, what I want to do is go ahead and take our second break. On my clock, we're coming up on let's see, 12:25 Central. And we'll take a 15-minute break, sort of not a huge break, but maybe long enough if somebody wants to, on your lunch break, grab a sandwich or something and then eat at your desk or at your screen as you come back. That would be great. So with that, if we could reconvene at 12:40 Central Time. And we'll move from the work that we've been, or from what we've been hearing from our two provocateurs here into our next exercise at that point. So we'll see everyone back at 12:40 Thank you very much. Get people started, and as others come back to the room, I'll bring them up to speed as well. So, you know, with this shift in mindset and the cultural shift that we've been, you know, exploring, you know, within the context of cybersecurity, cyber resilience this morning, one of the one of the ways that we can continue and deepen that exploration is to look at the ethics that are involved with that, and ethics being sort of the exploration of values, and values that could be in conflict in a given organization around important questions. And often when you're doing ethics work, you can propose a series of dilemmas or questions that could either be answered yes or no, but they have usually a situation where it's not absolutely clear. And so what I want to do is take advantage of that frame of questions from an ethics standpoint to examine again, where we're going with regard to these shifts in mind. So on the Google Doc workbook, if you went to page 21, there are 5 questions for individual reflection to begin with. And simply, do you agree that? And for each of them, if you can answer yes or no as you read these questions. First, cybersecurity for infrastructure and technologies that your organization designs, operates, and or maintains is primarily the responsibility of cyber professionals. Would you personally answer that yes or no? Second question, good cyber hygiene practices. And I should probably try and, for our benefit, define cyber hygiene practices here. Cyber hygiene practices are really practices and precautions that users take with regard to keeping sensitive data organized, safe, and secure from theft and outside attacks. Or a little bit more broadly, cyber hygiene can be thought of sort of as the practices from an IT perspective inside an organization to keep their IT operations safe and secure. So with that sort of layman's definition of cyber hygiene, and I'm sure Jonathan and Andre could probably give a much more refined definition of that, but using that, good cyber hygiene practices diligently implemented are sufficient for today's engineering practice. Yes or no, from your perspective? Third, the number of credit hours available in the current engineering curricula doesn't allow for dedicated cybersecurity coursework for engineering degree programs. Yes or no? 4, good cybersecurity for infrastructure and technology improves public safety. From your perspective, yes or no? And then finally, from the standpoint of professional excellence and the standard of care, engineers should be more concerned with technical problem solving, cost, and efficiency than ensuring cybersecurity. Again, from your perspective, yes or no? So if you've had a chance to go through those questions, what I'd like to do is have you move into small groups. And in your small groups, I'd like you to essentially go through each of those questions and have a short discussion. How did you answer it? How did others answer it in your small group? But as well, as you reflect on each one of those questions and how you answered it, what I'd also like you to try and bring forward is, how do you think others in your organization or surrounding you in your part of the engineering community would have answered that question? Would there be a difference between perhaps how you answered it or how you answered it today after 2.5 hours of our work this morning versus how you think others in your organization would have answered? So I'd like you to have that discussion, each of those 5 questions. Once again, when we move you into small group, if you can charter it in terms of roles and introduce yourselves, since you'll be in a slightly different grouping. And then if you can go through each of those questions, I'd recommend, you'll have about 20 minutes to do this. So I'd recommend, from a timekeeper standpoint, 3-4 minutes on each of the questions, sharing how each of you answered it, and also then discussing and reflecting on those answers. And then after you've gone through each of the 5, if you can spend 2 or 3 minutes and identify, particular insights or things that stood out in your conversation that you would like to report out to the whole group. Doesn't have to be about all 5 of them. Might be a couple insights that are particularly about one or another of them. All right, so that's the exercise. Mike, if we can move everyone into 3 groups, that would be great. And you've got a total of 22 minutes, 22 minutes.
IT cybersecurity falls under my umbrella as well.
Let's take a listen with regard to some of the standout observations, things that seem particularly juicy or important, or that generated some interesting conversation inside your small groups. You don't have to report out something on each one of those questions, but just a couple key insights based on your discussions, and again, we'll just sort of go through all 3 groups. So group number 1, your presenter, and what was going on in your conversation?
Yeah, we had some very interesting conversations, and we chose to focus, or we had a very good conversation on item number 1, and we were not in lockstep on that, and there were great points on either side. So the people who said that the responsibility of the cyber professionals, that it should not be just their responsibility, talked about it should be everyone's responsibility, and it should be spread across the entire organization, that everybody's taking part in it. And that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Need to be thinking all the way through the process. But the folks that said yes, it should primarily be the responsibility of the cyber professionals, did not disagree that it should be included in the entire process, but that there needs to be a champion to make sure the group's work is focused and effective throughout the course of the project, or that the objective is met. So I thought that was a very interesting perspective from both sides, and but it had very good merits on both. And then the other one we talked about was, we were very seemed to be adamant on as a group, is cybersecurity. This is the question about not enough credit hours available in the engineering curricula for cybersecurity for engineering professionals. And we thought that cybersecurity should not be a course per se, or maybe it can be, but it should also be baked fully throughout the engineering curricula, so that you get the repetition, it becomes more familiar, and you can identify it in that manner, and that you have a better chance of retaining it and applying it as you go out into the workforce and start applying what you learned. So we, as a group, we were nearly unanimous on that should be woven into the curricula as opposed to just one standalone course. So those were the 2 that we identified.
Any from other members of group 1, any nuance that you would add to John's recitation? Let me ask one thing. This might not just for group 1 members, but as well for anyone, that particularly people that are sitting in consulting engineering companies. The notion of needing a champion, as well as that sort of overall, organizational responsibility on this, or that you have. Was there any discussion about, can people that are senior people that are responsible for IT inside your organizations, are they the right people to be the champion from a cybersecurity standpoint? Did you get into that discussion, or do you have thoughts about it?
We did just a little bit, and I would say no. I think at the IT level, they're responsible for data integrity, security of that data, privacy of that data. And it's very much an IT role. And when it comes to the other side of the fence with OT and the clients that we serve, that's the engineering staff and their roles. And right now, the OT security in consulting engineering is a little bit rare.
Mm-hmm. Did others have similar observations?
I'll jump in. I'm on the city side, City of Houston side. We
thanks.
have a very, very large IT department. And just like what Warren just said, I mean, they're really focused on hardware, software, making sure we don't respond to phishing exercises to protect our servers. But they have no knowledge of the operating systems. And it's really the engineering side, the engineering functions that should be focusing on cybersecurity of the operating systems. That's a good point.
Good. Yeah, that had come up, as we prepared for this session and conversations with the provocateurs and others guiding sort of design of this. That distinction between IT and good hygiene, as in that second question about IT practices, and doing that effectively inside the organization doesn't make you necessarily the right person to be the cybersecurity champion or the source of knowledge and perspective about those. And making that shift, or not assuming the IT people can take care of it, which there might be some of those assumptions by the engineering staff inside the company. Was significant. Good. Well, let's go to group two. What did you what stood out in your conversations? A couple notes.
So I'll say for number 3, I think we agreed with group 1. We just, one point to make is, we felt, is there enough time available to devote to it without taking away from other priorities, such as like environmental concerns that are, prevalent today. And then we had a lot of discussion on number 5, relating it back to the example that I think Andrew gave about the pump stations. And we designed that station, or that series of stations, at the request of the client. But if there's that issue where it goes down, like, does that become professional negligence? Can they, can we be brought into a lawsuit if something happened? Obviously they would need to prove it, but how burdensome is that proof? We think right now, like, it's a, based on our discussions today, it's a push to become part of this professional standard of care, but it's not probably there yet. And will take time to get there.
So
Yeah,
that's
agreed.
interesting. When OEA was being first discussed, one of the things that the EPA said, I was in the room with a bunch of water utilities and some engineering firms and a couple of EPA administrators. And what they said was that while they weren't going to fine and they weren't going to audit, there had been a legal opinion that had been written that there was a fiduciary responsibility. And so when you talk about liability, I think that fiduciary responsibility kind of got to the heart of the fact that theoretically somebody could choose to take legal action because they were exchanging, clean water for money, basically.
Yeah, that whole inquiry about how that sits with regard to, standard of care does change. And, things that wouldn't have been expected to be the responsibility, or from a negligence standpoint would have been clearly fine 50 years ago, have shifted. And so is cybersecurity and all of the risks associated with that, going to impact and sort of generate a new standard of care for practicing engineers across disciplines. is an important part of this inquiry.
There's
All
some
right, group.
states looking
Oh,
at-
yeah, Andre.
There's some states looking at legislation to provide some safe harbor legislation for organizations to invest in cybersecurity. Florida, Wisconsin, and Ohio. So if organizations are adhering to industry best practices for cybersecurity, they're going to have, I guess all they can do is limit the amount of damages if there's any type of litigation. But they're looking at doing safe harbors as more of a carrot than a stick.
Okay, thanks, Andre. Yeah, and we'll hear more from Andre a little bit later in the program. But that whole notion of how do you once you establish like your organization is involved with new standards, new certifications or whatever, what impact does that have with regard to standard of care? And then how do you address that both from the standpoint of the legal system, but also other areas? So great. Okay, group 3.
All right, if everybody's not tired of hearing me talk yet. So we had some good discussions in a couple of areas. For question 2, I think the consensus was that it's a group effort, right? Because the engineers don't necessarily know what they know or know what they need to know. And the cyber professionals don't necessarily understand the design build of any specific structure or system. So it's that information sharing that's going to make that work. I think the consensus in question 3 was that there are not credit hours available. Very few, if any. Sometimes it might be a subtopic as part of a class or a guest lecture or something like that, but it's not something outside of a few specific colleges and universities. University of Texas San Antonio comes to mind for me, that have made cyber part of their focus, where it's going to start to creep into the engineering spaces. And then when we talked about question 4, we had this broader discussion about the concept of privacy and what that means, kind of the trade-off in public safety. And we talked about things like, facial recognition in public spaces, and being able to utilize data to track where people drive from, let's say, highway tolling or traffic cameras and things like that. And so that was a pretty lively discussion about where is that balance between safety and security versus having some rights. And one of the people in the conversation mentioned that when they went to do something, they were on vacation in Europe, they got a privacy notification from Google Photos that they had not gotten in the US because GDPR exists there and it doesn't here. If you're not in California, you don't have similar privacy regulation.
All right. Well, thanks for those observations. One of the things I'll observe is, most of the professional societies, have, pay close attention to ethics and have groups that work with regard to professional ethics from their perspective, whether it's the civil engineers or structural engineers, et cetera. And often what they do is, continually work these questions. Not that there's a clear, definitive answer one way or the other on these questions, but they represent sort of dilemmas or areas where there's fuzziness, but that it's important for those people that are part of that society or part of that practice area to continually be trying to sort of compare notes with each other and inquire and sort of inform each other in the conversation that can take place around questions like this. And so, deepening the inquiry about, these types of things, I think can be part of that shift in mindset or that we're talking about today. All right, with that, thank you for, good work in the small groups. What I'd like to do is go to our next provocateur. And, we just talked about some of the educational aspects of this and things like that. But I'd like to bring in Mikhail Chester. And Mikhail is professor of civil, environmental, and sustainable engineering at Arizona State University and is director of the Meta Center for Infrastructure and Sustainable Engineering at the University School of Sustainable Engineering Built Environment. We had shared as part of the pre-reading one of the articles that he and a colleague had put together that I think as we were sort of thinking about the design of this spoke to a number of important dimensions with regard to cybersecurity and cyber resilience. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Mikhail, and thank you.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Mike. And glad to be here with you all. Let me get this PowerPoint shared. Before I jump in, I'll respond to one of the comments that I just heard. Can you introduce this at the undergraduate curriculum, right? And as a faculty member, I'm, happy to chime in there. One of the constraints that we have is a civil engineering education, whether it's Arizona State or Texas A&M or MIT or Berkeley or anywhere else, is essentially the same, guys. It's essentially 120 credit hours, often dictated by ABET accreditation, which is a bunch of outside folks that come in and tell you this is what a civil engineer is. The civil engineer needs to have a course in how a water treatment plant works, how structural analysis is done, right? And I think it's important to recognize that you have to kind of fundamentally go back and question how this social governance happens in a way that forms how we understand what an engineer is, whether it's civil, mechanical, electrical, or anything else, and start to break down those sort of lock-in informal governance barriers that, essentially condition how it is that we form this undergraduate curriculum. So even if we want to create space for example, cybersecurity, sustainability, climate adaptation, and so on, often you're basically asking students to take courses beyond those 120 credit hours. And as you know, many of them can't afford to do it. They don't have the time to do it. They don't necessarily have the interest or the wherewithal to see that they should be doing it. So, it's a constant struggle to, kind of get away from the ways of the old to open up space for the new. And with that, let me jump into what I was actually going to talk about, which is the cyber frontier and infrastructure. So, we think about at ASU in our sustainable engineering curriculum and cohort, as well as the center that I run, as well as a number of the initiatives that I run broadly, how innovation and disruption happens in engineering, in infrastructure, or doesn't, right? That's the other way to look at it. What does it mean to create space for innovation and disruption? And as Kyle and Mike asked me to talk to you guys today about cybersecurity, I thought it was important to at least start with some context on the changing nature of infrastructure systems. And I think as I've been listening in today, here and there, I'm hearing, some great insights from you all in terms of, how these systems are changing. But I think it's important to just sort of fundamentally question and really make sure that we're grasping how these systems are changing before we understand how to address cybersecurity. So let me start there. Then I'll talk a little bit about, expanding on what I just said, talking a little bit more about how I see what we as infrastructure professionals need to do, what competencies we need to have, and then try to ground all of this within some broader perspectives of the changing nature of these systems and what that might mean. So with that being said, here we are, it's 2024, and I'm showing you pictures of assets and systems from, almost 100 years ago now. Doesn't feel like it, but we're approaching, some of those years down there is almost 100 years ago. And the backbone technologies that define our infrastructure in many ways have not changed. The ways that we distribute power, from the Thomas Edison era of New York City and Pearl Street, the ways that we deploy water from the late 1800s or early 1900s, which largely were developed out of Hamburg, Germany, made their way to the US. Water utilities start to become, a major system in the early to mid 1900s, like many of our other systems. The ways that we use transportation systems in many ways are rooted in these technologies that are 100 years old. And that is quickly eroding. So I think we inherit these systems, we train people to work within these systems and mental models of how these systems work that are largely rooted in 100-year-old ways of thinking. But at the same time, we've got rapid acceleration and integration of cyber technologies and infrastructure. And when I say that, I don't mean that these technologies are simply becoming add-ons to the backbone technologies from 1950, the dumb technologies. I heard somebody make the comment earlier, I think right on, about, you know, what smart means and questioning smart. I completely agree. Often it's a polysemous word. It's a vacuous term that, you know, just sort of is a catch-all for anything cyber. But I think we need to be much more pointed about how we understand that. But here we are seeing not only technologies, trends, and capabilities exploding in front of us. You know, I actually taught yesterday in my urban infrastructure anatomy class a cyber connected systems lecture, and I was looking up some new statistics to update my slides. And, you know, one of the statistics that I saw said something like 80% of major companies now use cloud computing in some way or another, right? It's not that unsurprising. So here we are, where you've got these technologies, trends, capabilities that are not only rapidly accelerating, but are rapidly integrating, and there's consequences there. This isn't simply layering of old technologies on top of, laying new technologies on top of old. We're fundamentally changing the DNA of these infrastructure systems. I think that's the crux of what it is that I'm trying to get across today, right? The DNA, it's not those old technologies that I showed you a few slides ago. I mean, it still is, but in many ways that's rapidly pivoting to something else. And I don't think we fully grasp what that something else is yet. I'm going to give you guys some semblance of what I think it is. But in order to do cybersecurity, we got to fundamentally recognize that these trends are upon us, that they're happening. They're fundamentally changing the nature of these systems. You know, to give you some kind of microcosms, you think when you press the gas pedal in your car, you're actually engaging with the throttle? You're not. You're engaging with a microprocessor and computer that's deciding the acceleration profile of your vehicle. So, you know, there's a number of these hardware for software substitutions that are happening. I mean, think about, guys, how over the past 3 or 4 years, Southwest and Delta both have experienced collapses of the airline industry due to software issues and computing issues, right? So is Delta or Southwest, is any other airline company? Or is it a information and communications company where, you know, sort of the underlying infrastructure is ICT that ultimately enables the physicality of these systems to emerge, right? It's something in between these two. So it's important to recognize this changing dynamic and the increasing hybridity of the system, and ultimately what that hybridity brings as coupled hybrid cyber physical systems. So one of the things that it brings is what I'm going to call the diffusion of control. So I think we're very used to, as infrastructure professionals, this paradigm where there's essentially 2 players. There's the infrastructure organization, so to speak, that delivers supply. And then there's the users that consume that supply. And I think for the past 100 years, that's largely been the case. These infrastructure organizations are providing supply of services, and in many ways, they're fully in control of how electrons move, of how molecules of water move, of how transportation services are consumed. They set the objectives. They, in many ways, decide who is going to win out in this system and who is going to be a disadvantage in this system, right? So there's the equity question at play as well. Also, these organizations have had what I'm going to call cognition and understanding of what's going on in these systems in a somewhat limited way. So a transportation agency is going to have loop detectors in the road, and wherever those limited loop detectors are, they're able to have some semblance of what's going on in terms of traffic. Nowadays, who has more cognition of traffic? Is it Google and Apple through the pinging of phones that happen? Or is it the transportation agencies? It's Google and Apple, far more cognition. Let me extend that example a little bit further. Who's steering traffic more and more? I would say Google and Apple, as we navigate, are being steered by software and algorithms in terms of how we consume supply. And we're quickly eroding this model of a 2-party system, that being the infrastructure organizations and the users. And this is what we're starting to see. Third parties introduce themselves, largely enabled by cyber technologies, that are opening up control of the system and radically changing this paradigm of who gets to decide what. And they're doing this for a number of reasons. One, because in many ways, these infrastructure organizations simply haven't been able to keep up with the pace of change. So third-party developers have. About 4 years ago, I was on sabbatical at UCLA. And whenever I wanted to take the bus, I would use an app. And that app was not from LA Metro, the third largest transit agency in the country. It was a third-party developer that had much more sophisticated algorithms that did a much better job of telling me when I should leave my house to get to the next, to get to the bus stop to catch the next bus. So you've got these third-party app developers driven by cloud-based computing, private companies that are increasingly steering how we consume infrastructure services. Think about car manufacturers in charging, whether it's Tesla or anybody else. Is Tesla a car company? Is it a transportation company? Is it energy company? It's all of the above. And ultimately, we're starting to see Google and Apple Maps introduce themselves into transportation services. We're starting to see all sorts of ICT companies that are increasingly steering control over how we consume these services. They do that for a reason, and it's because there's all sorts of advantages in terms of improving the efficiency and capability of the system. But of course, as we've been talking about today, we have vulnerabilities that are also introduced. And to take a page from Clausewitz on war, I heard references to, I think, some of this earlier today. We're starting to see a pivot in how warfare is conducted from government and militaries to government and populations. This is called asymmetric warfare, and this is enabled largely by cyber technologies that have been introduced into infrastructures. Infrastructures are becoming battle spaces, and we have to recognize that this dynamic is at play. So I'll come back to what this means in a second, but asymmetric warfare is a major pivot. We're seeing this play out between Russia and Ukraine. We're seeing this play out in Israel and Gaza. But essentially, the opening up of cyber technologies into infrastructure allow foreign adversaries into the US. The US has been doing this in other countries, of course, and many other countries do this to themselves. But these vulnerabilities are introduced. This would be an extreme asymmetric warfare. But looking at the less extreme, you've got everything from nuisance type attacks with infrastructure, from opening them up to cyber tech, anything from vandalism. For example, your high schooler that's bored and just wants to see if they can get into the system, to incursion, to advanced persistent threats, which are things like breaches, espionage, and strategic disruption, again, at the extreme, leading to asymmetric warfare. The number of cyber attacks, DHS tracks this on infrastructure, is exponentially increasing. And the way that we see, for example, ransomware attacks play out is exponentially increasing as it relates to infrastructure. Is this an IT problem? I'm going to tell you guys fundamentally no. I think this is a problem where, as to the points you guys were raising in your feedback in the last session, in how we fundamentally rebuild the capabilities around how we understand not only what these systems are doing, but also how we protect them. So to that point, I think it's critically important that we start by thinking of infrastructure not simply as an amalgamation of hardware and cyber technologies, but as knowledge systems. We forget this, that infrastructure agencies are first and foremost structured to deliver and produce knowledge. The question is, what type of knowledge? And increasingly, that knowledge is going to have to be around hybrid physical and cyber systems, whereas in the past, it's been okay to get away with knowledge that has been largely geared towards physical systems that were designed with technologies for the last century. So that's quickly becoming less and less relevant. Similarly, what is your system? So is the Delta system, the airline system, one of airplanes and airports? No, it's increasingly one, to my earlier example, of information around scheduling and ultimately how we provide service through analytics and software that ultimately inform us of what's going on in the system and how we effectively operate it. So the diffusiveness, there's a diffusion that's happening across these boundaries, right? Our electric cars, energy systems, are they transportation systems? They're a little bit of both. Cyber technologies open this up both as their own infrastructure and as cross-boundary diffusion of infrastructure. Next, infrastructure are increasingly battlefields. So we're seeing this play out. We're at the precipice of this with ransomware. But if you think that your system is not yet been probed and possibly intruded on, you're probably being naive. I think we are, to the points that were raised earlier, at the beginning stages of a new type of warfare, and we haven't yet begun to see how this warfare plays out and what it means. I think you've got an older generation of the workforce that is not yet privy to the ways in which technology might disrupt. I think you have younger people that are coming into the workforce that are ready to just deploy technologies, IoT left and right. And in general, we as a community across these generations just aren't prepared for generating the types of knowledge that we need within our organization to be able to respond to this. By the way, that top right figure is from one of our papers. All the sites are down there, but we adapted it from MITRE Corporation that does a lot of great thinking around this. But we tried to sort of contextualize from sort of nuisance type attacks on the left to strategic disruption and persistent disruption on the right in the red. When you look at the corresponding blue, how you might build out capabilities within your organization to be doing this. So if this is just nuisance type stuff, an IT department might be able to handle it. But once you get to pervasive attacks and advanced persistent threats on your system, you need to make cybersecurity part of the DNA of what your system does, of what your organization does. And then the last point I'll make is that, to my earlier point about the diffusion of control, who's in control of these systems? Increasingly, it's not the infrastructure managers. It raises an interesting question of what governance should be in this day and age. So, I've been to talks where I've heard, for example, a transit agency say, yeah, Uber and Lyft are probably going to disrupt how people consume transit. And as such, we want to work with them to make sure that, Uber and Lyft and any other ride-hailing service is sort of in symbiosis with, how we consume transportation services or provide transportation services. And I'm there thinking, I think ride-hailing is a huge disruption to transit, and in many ways could undermine the viability of transit in many different ways. We need to be thinking about this a lot differently. And I think this is the case for any other infrastructure system where you perceive cyber technologies in some way or another going to have some sort of disruption that's going to decrease your ability to control the supply of the service. And as such, you might think of yourselves more as consensus builders of what these different parties are doing in terms of making sure the public welfare is preserved in terms of how those services are provided, who's benefiting from those systems, is it sustainable and equitable and resilient, and so on and so forth, and pivot away from these legacy perspectives of, we're the ones controlling this system, because increasingly you simply won't be able to do it, right? As I put solar panels on my house and start having smart thermostats and start driving an electric car, increasingly I'm handing over control to car companies, to thermostat companies, to anybody else, the solar company, for example, and less away from the power provider who's used to being in total control of this system.
So just about 3 more minutes, Mikhail.
With that, I'll raise the stakes here. I don't actually think that what we're talking about here is rapidly hybridizing cyber physical infrastructure systems. I actually view this as legacy infrastructures are being consumed, subsumed, ingested into a cognitive ecosystem. I'm going to put my academic hat on here and give me a little bit of leeway here. But I think what we are actually seeing are the early stages of slow-moving systems that were designed for the last century being consumed into a data economy, cognitive infrastructure, and ultimately cyber-physical infrastructure systems that are newly emerging, that ultimately are driving an entirely new ecosystem and landscape that ultimately we are not prepared for. And I think this cognitive ecosystem is one that we have to recognize is playing out when Google and Apple decide how people are steered on our roadways. We have almost no control over this. And ultimately we are, seeing again, just the early stages of a small dynamic that I think is going to be magnified and exponentially increased in ways that, we are in many ways not prepared for. So, I think recognize that this dynamic is at play and, ask yourself, are we in control or not? And I think the answer is often going to be, we're not. With that being said, guys, thanks, and happy to participate in the discussion going forward.
All right. Again, any quick questions for Mikhail? I do have one. Just on your end point in terms of the this evolving new cognitive ecosystem. How does if that's the case and it is sort of you're seeing that evolution, how is that showing up, do you think, or how will that show up with regard to educating and preparing engineers in the schools?
Yeah, great question, Kyle. We're starting to see a significant pivot in the capabilities of engineers towards, for example, modeling of systems, digital modeling of systems. The sophistication of what we're seeing there is exploding on us. To the points that were raised earlier, we are starting to see some early signs in education around cyber vulnerability, cyber security, IoT, all things connected systems. There's obviously a huge push right now around AI and ML and how we bring that in. Those pieces of the puzzle are there, Kyle, in terms of how they come together. I think we're still trying to figure that out, and to my earliest point, make space for how we rethink what an engineer is, whether it's civil, mechanical, electrical, or anything else going forward.
Great. All right. Anybody else?
This is Steve Costello from the city of Houston.
Yeah,
Mikhail,
Steve.
I mean, that was an incredible presentation and thought-provoking. I want to thank you for that. I want to go back to the educational side of this. Since the education of the engineer is being identified by a group of people that's outside the academic world, how do we change that so that we could sort of change this discussion that you just brought up to the new students? How do we change that?
Yeah, I mean, Steve, the very first thing that comes to mind, I was thinking about this as you guys were talking earlier, is go yell at your local universities that you hire from and say, no, we need this competency, right? They do listen, right? We actually have an external advisory board of industry professionals, infrastructure professionals from the Phoenix area at ASU. We talk to them a couple times a year. They'll come in and they'll say, this is what we need. Make sure your graduates are getting this training. And 10 years ago, we were hearing things like, we need better CAD designer and ArcGIS people. Now we're starting to hear more of this sort of stuff, right? We need more cybersecurity professionals. At ASU, we're quite aware of the national landscape and the gap in the number of graduates from infrastructure professions around cybersecurity and the number of cybersecurity jobs in infrastructure that are out there. We do look at those job market reports and we're sensitive to that. But Steve, to your point, I mean, I think the first step is pushing on your universities that you hire from and say, no, you guys got to be responsive to this dynamic that's emerging.
Thank you.
All right. you know, again, you know, the next another one of the, you know, sort of great provocations this, today. We have one more in store for you, but we're going to take a short break before we go there and bring on Andre Restaino to offer his perspective, particularly from that, you know, his work with ISA with regard to certification standards and other aspects of, in one sense, I might call it the infrastructure of, you know, technology that's provided by the work that his organization and others do. So with that, let's just take a short, it's a mini break, 5 minutes, and then we'll reconvene for our next provocation. So right now I have, let's just call it 11, well, it's 11:46 my time, 1:46 Central. So 5 minutes from now, so that'd be about 51. Now I know 5 minutes is tough. We'll see. We'll see if we convene at that point, or it might take a couple extra minutes to get everybody back. Thank you all listening back behind those screens in terms of our quorum here. And what I want to do is introduce sort of the last of our provocateurs. You can kind of think of this as the last baton pass in our relay race today between the provocateurs. And I want to introduce Andre Restaino. Andre is the managing director for Global Alliances, Consortia, and Conformance Programs at the Institute for, or excuse me, the International Society of Automation. And in that role, he's a recognized global leader with regard to product and systems certification, or product and systems cybersecurity assurance and certification programs and standards. And so really pleased to have Andre with us as well as that last baton pass today. So with that, Andre, please take it from there.
Okay. I'll start my screen sharing. Oh, I stopped. Okay, so I should be sharing now. And I'll go to slideshow. We good?
We're good. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So I work at ISA, International Society of Automation, and our mantra is to elevate OT cybersecurity from an art to a science to an engineering discipline, largely based on the 62443 OT cybersecurity standards. We see a lot of things coming from our government and some industry sectors, you know, about do this best practice, do this, here are the 3 things. It's kind of a whack-a-mole approach to getting your systems secured. What's really needed is to take more of a systems level perspective, holistic approach, and, you know, treat cybersecurity as a program, not a project. So International Society of Automation has been around for about 75 years. We're an ANSI accredited standards development organization. We have about 15,000 members across the globe in over 190 countries, and we do events. But our main mission is, as a professional engineering society, is to help sharpen the saw. So we certify technicians, automation technicians, and automation engineers, like the design engineers. We've published over 150 standards as an ANSI accredited standards development organization. And we do conferences and other things. So that's a little bit about me, but we don't need to go into all that. But we're quite busy in the cybersecurity space. So these top 3 paragraphs are programs that I oversee. So Kyle mentioned that we have a program to certify conformance of automation and control systems to this 62443 series of standards. We've been doing this for almost 15 years now. We were ahead of the market curve probably by almost 10 years. 80% of our certifications have been done in the last 3 years or so. I also oversee this other organization. So we have about 45 companies supporting that, plus the ones getting certified. I oversee this other organization that has 60 companies to bridge the gap between the standards and their adoption. We create a lot of free materials that help company adopt the standards, materials that help universities and community colleges. We try to find ways to get the standards into their hands to augment their programs. And we also stood up this thing called Incident Command System for Industrial Control Systems. So we've been collaborating with FEMA, CISA, and INL. It's 1,400 volunteers from over 800 companies all around the globe. And this is kind of the back end to this whole cybersecurity challenge that companies have. How do you respond to incidents? How do you train people for even leading the response to an incident? So we're putting together materials. You can go to the website. It's all for free. And we do two things. We develop people, like a workforce development in this space. And then we do training exercises and help establish playbooks. So much of what we do is based on the output of the ISA 99 Standards Committee. And it's been around since 2002 after 9/11. We started publishing these standards. There's over 1,400 volunteers from all around the globe. We have an education and training department. In 2022, we trained over 3,000 students. I think this year it's going to be closer to 5,000 students all around the globe. We do it virtually. We have computer-based training. We have physical training facilities here in North Carolina and also in the Netherlands and Eindhoven, and then through agreements with universities around the US, we're doing training. So circling back to the standards themselves, the standards are based on the CIA triangle: confidentiality, availability, and integrity. And in IT systems, data confidentiality and integrity are prime objectives. But with control systems, availability, because things are moving and spinning and you have to be monitoring and controlling them 7/24, 365 days a year. And with OT cybersecurity, the IACS, Industrial Automation Control Systems, the cybersecurity is a function of the technical capabilities, plus the maturity of the operational security policies and procedures at that site, and then the cybersecurity skill level of personnel at that site. And that includes everybody from management to staff to admin to the folks actually operating the system. So the standards are big. There's 15 parts. And so generally speaking, what's in them? And this is what I think makes them valuable and establishes a foundation for treating OT cybersecurity as an engineering discipline. The standards include concepts and models. A lot of folks talk about the Purdue model, and there's this all debate about, is that an old one, but it's still a good one. Has terms and terminology. So it's really difficult to discuss a problem if you don't have a vocabulary that's consistent amongst all the participants in the discussion. And then the standards define roles and responsibilities of all the participants in this shared responsibility model. And then the standards are also good in that they define security capability level definitions and also the requirements that go along with the security capabilities. There's 4 levels. And then there's a process maturity level definition and also the requirements that go with those. So it's not the whack-a-mole approach. It's well structured, well articulated with models, terms, all the things you need to create an engineering discipline around OT cybersecurity. So as an example, these are the 4 security levels that are defined in the IEC 62443 standards. So there's the security level 1, that's the lowest level, and security level 4 is the highest level. So security level 1, you see it's green all the way across. It protects against coincidental cyber incidents. That's something that's accidental or self-inflicted wound, poor work habits, that sort of thing. It's not until you get to security level 2 that the protections protect against intentional attacks. And so security level 2 really should be the minimum. If you're a product supplier, you really want to try to achieve security level 2 or higher. We did a white paper on that. We just published it. It's up on our website under the Learning Center, but on ISA Secure. But at any rate, so this is part of the definition. Another foundational concept is shared responsibility for cybersecurity. So if you start on the bottom left-hand side, we look at product suppliers. There's 3 major roles defined in 62443. Product suppliers, they design and manufacture the commercial off-the-shelf control systems. And there's the service providers. So they're integrators and maintenance and operational service providers. So typically on new systems, they're the integrators, and then they engineer and integrate the off-the-shelf systems into site-specific solutions. And then the asset owners, who ultimately have responsibility for operating, maintaining, and agreeing on target security levels and system design. And so they run them over their full life cycle. But you can see the arrows going up, indicating the interplay between these 3 different stakeholder groups that have a shared responsibility. If there's a cyber incident at an asset owner site, you still have to do a triage and determine, was it an accident, something unintentional, or was it really a machine breakdown? Was there a problem with discipline or an operator issue? So these different groups need to triage what the issue is. And it could be that there was a bug in the system or a security flaw, which means it goes back to the product supplier, and their responsibility is to get it fixed or provide a reasonable workaround. And so the standards are aligned with these 3 stakeholder groups. So here's just a little picture showing this, the key standards that align with each of them and the shared responsibility. So you can see there's 4 standards. It's more complex for the asset owner. And there are a lot of things to take into consideration. The overall security program requirements. So if you're in an operating site that already is using ISO 27000, with your CISO, then you have to find a way to take your 62443 standards and dovetail them into that overall program. And they work together just fine. We've written papers on that too. Or if you don't have a program, then the 2-1 standard, the first one you see here, will suffice to do everything. So, but you can see going down to the integration and maintenance service provider, there's a standard for it, 2-4, and same thing at the bottom. So at the bottom left, this is the 3-3 system security capabilities, the security development life cycles, 4-1, and the component requirements. That's what we use for certifying product. We've been doing that for over 10 years. A different way to look at that, I'm being a little bit repetitive here, but another way to look at this is, you can see the different standards in this Venn diagram. And so, certain sections are predominantly for an asset owner or a product supplier or a service provider. But then there's other parts of the standard that provide context, like the operating model, service or security levels, and some other things that they all share. So But it's not that bad. For the most part, each of these roles have one to a couple of standards. So different way of looking, another way to look at the standards is from the life cycle, like I talked about earlier. And this bar chart shows you where in the life cycle the standards apply. So if you're in the early part where you're developing the product itself, they're at the very front end of the cycle. The development requirements down here at the bottom left, technical security capabilities. But if you're looking at design and integration at the operating site, the 2-1 standard up here in this top right corner applies, and some of the others as well. So, and this diagram's a bit of an eye chart, but it's in a document that I sent to Kyle, and they're also on the web. It's downloadable for free, but this is probably, if you actually take the time to look at it, it's probably one of the most informative diagrams that address cybersecurity throughout the automation life cycle. So at the front end, you know, when you're doing, let's say you're doing a new system, you're doing a specification and design, you know, and it shows these little boxes. It shows what the role is. So the blue is the asset owner, and then, you know, whether they're accountable or responsible for it. And then there's some bullet points that say what's supposed to happen in the specification phase, what happens in the design phase, et cetera, as you go on down. So if you're in a greenfield project, this is what it would look like starting way back at the specification phase. If you're looking at securing an as-built environment, you're all the way over here, the operation maintenance phase. And so all these other things where you had opportunities for designing security in, they were all left out. And so now you're having to find a way to shoehorn these other steps into you know, a system that's already managing and controlling and monitoring production equipment that's in place today. So, you know, just some key things, you know, greenfield versus as-built. You're doing a greenfield system, you have a blank slate, you can design in security with modern technology. The big challenge is you know, a lot of the suppliers haven't updated their technology with advanced security. Some of them are still doing the minimums, which is a shame. We've been building these standards for 20 years, and the suppliers have been around that long. And you know, I think they've been slow in building in security. But in the as-built environment, that's legacy, or whether you're in operation, you're dealing with an architecture already in place. It's hard to change. You don't have a blank slate. And in particular, you're trying to secure old technology. It's either difficult to retrofit or it's no longer supported, and other challenges.
So Andre, this is your 3-minute time check.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, so just a little, so these are just a list of various organizations that we've been working with, INL and the Community of Practice. We're collaborating on a white paper or an approach to show how the cyber-informed engineering works with 62443. And we're also working on workforce development and various other, you know, initiatives here and there with other labs, the North American Transmission Forum, and NEMA, Open Process Automation Forum, and others. So we've done advocacy and testimony to governments in Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia. So if someone asked, hey, what would you do to secure my site? You know, what should I do? What's the first thing I need to do? And my answer is you first have to get educated. So I'd recommend you take classes and learn the models, vocabulary, get your key people trained as needed. So when you sit down and when you're having your discussion, you all have the same picture in mind. I'd work with management in a CIE fashion to identify critical assets to protect, focus on those. And then develop your protection plan and funding. You can do a lot through education, training, and policy without investing in new technology. And also develop a response and recovery plan to improve your resilience. That's important, and practice a plan. And then carried out the other detailed cyber hygiene activities. But go after the big stuff, prioritize, get trained first. So that's pretty much it. This is a list of the links to the various organizations that I oversee, and there's just tons of free material coming from International Society of Automation. And this is all purpose-built for OT cybersecurity. So that's it.
Okay, Andre, I wonder, just as a quick question for me, if I'm sitting in a consulting engineering organization or a government agency like Steve, City Houston, how do I access, where would I start with regard to accessing the training, particularly the educational side of what you're offering there?
Yeah, so we have, you could go straight to our website, isa.org, and just, click on the training link. And there's a bunch of training. There's different tracks. There's some tracks for the asset owners. There's a track for product developers. There's another track for system integrators. So just go straight there. And some is computer-based, some is instructor-led, some is instructor-led virtual. So there's a whole variety. A lot of it's already scheduled, like instructor-led. The computer-based, you can just sign up for it and take the classes anytime, 24/7, which a lot of folks like, because it's especially in these operating environments for an employee to take time off one of their shifts to go to a training is very, very difficult. So, or you can send me an email and I'll set you up with our training coordinator, and they can get you signed up and provide more detailed recommendations.
Okay, thanks, Andre. Any other questions or comments from participants for Andre? Okay, with that, I want to proceed into our last exercise then. And if you went ahead in the workbook to really page 32 is the outline. And this really is an exercise that's really about summarizing, capturing, what we've heard today and having an opportunity to share that with each other. And so we're going to put you once again into, I think, what have we got? 3 groups still. Inside those groups, what I'd like for you to do is have a short conversation, which, ask you to sort of, think about, and observe what were some of the most important things that you've heard today, either coming from the provocateurs or from your small group work. Most important ideas, insights about the evolving role of the engineering community with regard to cybersecurity and critical infrastructure. What really has stood out for you. And in particular, then the second question there is, what mind shifts will be necessary if you really thought about it? And, we've got to go from safety to X as a mind shift. What particular ones stood out for you today? So in your small groups, what I'd like you to do, Mike, if you can set it for 17 minutes. For the small groups, and take a couple minutes once again, just designate roles. That should be quicker and quicker here. And then inside your small groups, if you can take about 15 minutes to have that conversation, go through each of those prompts, and then, summarize, 2 or 3 items that you'd like to report out to the whole group. All right, with that, please proceed into the breakout.
You're muted, Kyle.
Thanks all. Want to go back into whole group here and once again, hear from each one of the groups about, what stood out in their conversation, reflecting on, where we've gone on this learning journey for the last 4.5 hours. And let me just start with group one. What seemed to be significant in your conversation?
I don't know that we had a note taker, but you were taking some pretty good notes, Kyle. I thought you were reporting out for us.
No, I'll offer my observations, but I think, pick out a couple things that stood out for you.
Just maybe so as a group, engineers are slow adopters usually, pretty conservative. What does that look like going forward on the cybersecurity side of things? I don't know, I don't know if Trish or there's somebody else wants to jump in there. That's kind of one of the things that stood out for me.
Kind of at the end, we were kind of talking about public policy and how does that play a role in what this looks like as we move forward for the engineering profession.
I will say, as you guys were talking about that, and I was, sort of listening in and discussing, the visual that I was certainly fastened on in my mind as we talked about engineers as slow adopters was, this the pictures of the 100-year-old infrastructure that Mikhail had been, that he started with, is that how much of the engineering, mentality is still sitting there in terms of how do we engineer and design that type of infrastructure, as opposed to this cognitive Mikhail's model of cognitive ecosystem as infrastructure, which is a totally different. Wow. But the technology is changing at 100 miles an hour, and the engineering is changing at 10 miles an hour. And where's that going to leave us shortly with regard to dealing with this?
Physics doesn't change. Physics doesn't change. That's the thing.
So tell me more. I mean, as you say that, Andre, yeah, I think how do you? I mean, so how do you see that sort of influencing, the adoption rate, or how the culture can change for the engineering community? If I can put you on the spot.
Yeah, I just see I see the same journey with these automation and control systems, securing those very, very similar to the safety journey. And that with another group, my position is that the availability of information and the speed with which we can learn what to do is really rapid. Mostly it's sitting out there, between the standards and everything else. We know what to do. Who's going to take the first step? Who's going to make the investment? And how much is enough? It's still an unknown. There's people investment, there's money investment, and but there's a culture thing. I circle back. I still think that there has to be, this is one of these areas that's like safety, where we had to have legislation and OSHA and all that to move it along. And I deign to say I want more government, but there are a few things I think government can do, and defense, and this is one of them. And I think with OSHA, there have been a lot of deaths prevented. Same thing,
Okay.
I see the same life cycle similar to automobiles. Remember Unsafe at Any Speed, Ralph Nader with the Corvair? And there's all sorts of things. Now we have collapsible steering columns, not anti-lock braking systems. They're automated braking systems. They even brake without us touching them. Side and door intrusion beams, collapsible engine compartments, and that's everyday business. Most people don't even see that anymore. We're done. That's where we need to be with cybersecurity and these systems, where it's for a lot of the key protections, that's everyday business.
Yeah, but with the comment about OSHA and stuff, you're probably speaking to Trish, what you were, commenting the importance of sort of, the public policy realm in terms of, setting those
Yeah, policy language.
regulations in place.
Yeah, it needs to be married with what the engineers know. The legislators can't be prescriptive and provide the prescriptive answers, like two-factor authentication like they did with the TSA and pipelines.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let me go to group 2. What stood out in your conversation? I don't know who was in group 2, so anybody want to volunteer? Yeah, Daviani, thank you.
I guess we're kind of talking about I guess I'll talk about the mind shifts. Probably working with like Nancy is the one who said this, but while she's working with, like, when you're working with your clients, making them aware about the long-term impacts if a cyber attack, for example, takes place, and then providing a better product or service in terms of design that is much more secured in the long term versus like the short term. Yeah, I'm not sure if anyone else wants to add any of their remarks.
I think we talked about, at least I always bring up liability in different ways of, if we specify a product, a camera or whatever, and somebody hacks through it and gets in and causes some damage, and we didn't verify it was certified, whatever certification we want, is there more and more of that liability? Because, like a car has 200 or 2,000 chips or things where you can get into it, and more of our traffic signals and everything are talking over the airwaves, not even through wire. Is a certain group of professionals going to start picking up on that potential liability, and we have to think about that in when we're considering products, not only how good are they going to be, but what risk could be associated with them that are not necessarily physical risk, which brings in at least a conversation. I mentioned project kickoff meetings. I go to a whole lot of project kickoff meetings to use inquiry to try and find issues. But if we bring in a cyber professional to our project kickoff meeting, I would want not only to talk about what are the risks we could have, they ought to be able to bring in opportunities for us also, so we don't just look at it from a negative standpoint.
Good. All right, group 3.
Yeah, so we talked on a few different things, mainly engagement with the ourselves, in terms of needing to learn more about cybersecurity and adaptation in the future, or to the future, to help others or help clients. We also hit on, I think, what a little bit of group 2 was hitting on, was the resiliency side of things, and that needs to be explored a little bit more. And there's opportunity for true engineering to mitigate the severity of the consequences of cyber hacks and things like that. And I'll say we recognize that politics, when you look at outlook, like the politics side of things is a short-term outlook, whereas engineering needs to be a long-term outlook. And there's a struggle in the dynamics of control, because they politicians defer to engineers for safety, but we're beholden to, I guess, sort of them in terms of cost of the project and getting funding to implement, what we deem as safe.
Great.
One other thing from Group 3, which I sat in on, was the realization that addressing cyber issue is as much non-digital as it is digital in nature, which brings in traditional engineering as a key element in addressing cyber issues.
Great. Any other, from any of the groups, any, additional thoughts or comments as we begin to sum up our session today? Well, let me just comment in terms of where does where do we go from a Change Lab perspective? After each one of these summits, we do a number of things in order to, if you will, share our work, share the results of these learning journeys. Mike and I will be putting together a summit report, which we do after each one of these sessions, which we hope captures the heart of the learning and the insights, as well as the heart of what was offered from the provocateurs, so that people who weren't here can take advantage of those thoughts. In addition, we'll ask each of the provocateurs, and I think we've checked this box, or if we haven't, we'll circle back to them. In order to get have the presentations in terms of the PowerPoint slides available on our website, so that people can take a look at those and can access the various links, etc. Andre had a lot of resources and links in his slides that would be good to be able to share with people. So we'll do that on the website as well. Mike has made this recording, which will be there. So we've got anything. I mean, those are the principal ways we'll share the work that we've done here. Anything else, Mike, that I'm not thinking of?
No, those are the major things. We're open to presentations for any type of organization to summarize the work and other work we've done.
Yeah, so I mean that, as Mike says, that we could just have an open question. Does anyone have sort of an idea, or have ideas or perspectives that that you think that the Change Lab should be doing with this topic beyond what we've done today? Either sharing the learning that we've done together, or going deeper with regard to that dive in here. Any next steps that you see for the Change Lab?
One thing I thought was really interesting, and you have this with technology like now that's going so fast, is the resilience topic that we discussed briefly. Are things going to change so fast? Government can't afford to, we got 7,500 signals in Houston, let's say. We can't buy new modules for each controller every 5 years. we can't. So is that going to impact the speed of the technology development? And is the focus on the speed and more and more and more the real goal? And to me, we've had a little bit of discussion before on ethics in technology development. What cybersecurity issues do we have if my car talks to 2,000 other cars? And the dangers that may bring forth. So, I mean, there's so many different paths to go down with this subject.
Yeah, the complexity is there. Any other thoughts?
Kyle, I guess one thought, I mentioned it in our small group, but like we have case studies from the Board of Ethical Review and other organizations to teach ethics, in our companies and our education programs and stuff, having some case studies, kind of like what Andrew presented, I think would be helpful as we start to learn about how, as engineers, we need to be thinking about these things and incorporating them, the concepts into our designs. And so if, for the current engineers in practice, some kind of case studies in different areas would be helpful. And I don't know if that's something the Change Lab could do or could partner with one of our professional organizations or whatever, however we could do that, but that might be something we could look at.
Thanks, Trish.
Yeah, it might be interesting to, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, if you're interested in more presenters on the cybersecurity topic, I have pretty good access to a bunch of people that can present on all the different dimensions of this cybersecurity challenge.
Great.
Folks
Thanks.
from both the supplier side of the world to asset owners. And so if there's a topic that you're looking for somebody, then I'm pretty sure I can find them.
Excellent.
And I guess the other thing, we talked about engineering education and incorporating into the current curriculum instead of like creating something new. And I don't know that we really had anybody. We have people in ECL are involved in ECL and the engineering education space, maybe not here today, but that might be an interesting conversation to have if I don't know if the Association of Engineering Educators is looking at this issue or not, or,
Well, or next time we talk with Michael Milligan, who is, we've had, who's, leads ABET, and who's, has been a very generous, helper of our thinking at the Change Lab. Next conversation we have with him, it'd be interesting to visit with his perspective again. How do you, given the 120 hours and that sort of side, what his perspective is about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So if ABET says you have to do it, then they got to figure out a way to do it.
You might also consider. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
You might also consider, submitting papers to some of the national conferences like WEF or ACE for water. And then I know communities like ours have local engineering clubs that meet every month. That would be another good place to get the word out.
I wonder, Mike, you're actively involved with sort of the ACE mentor program, which is sort of the K through 12 STEM sort of work. It would also be interesting to develop some, just like they do build bridges and stuff like that. Can we scare the kids by having a cybersecurity sort of case study or something that they deal with to motivate their engagement?
I will do what I can there. And Warren's coworker, Brittany Yates, is attempting to connect us with WEF. So we'll continue to work on organizations like that. So.
All right. Thanks for those suggestions and comments. Really appreciate the sort of guidance. Mike, any final comments, thoughts from you?
Real quick, and hopefully this time you're just seeing the there. Hopefully you're just seeing the slide without my notes. Is that true?
Yes.
All right. So there's two upcoming opportunities we want you to be aware of. On June 19th, we'll have another virtual summit, this time looking at the engineering workforce of the future. We're in the planning of that. We will look at things like the looming enrollment cliff facing all of higher education, what is needed to attract and retain more young people in engineering education programs. If there's a shrinking number, we need to retain more. how do we break through the barriers preventing progress in attracting women and minorities into engineering? And how do we shift the culture of engineering organizations to be more welcoming to women and minorities and to embrace more of a purpose-driven practice? Then in September, we'll be back in Boulder for our annual Engineering Ideas Institute at the Colorado Chautauqua. This year's theme will be engineering practice in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, otherwise known as VUCA world. So we'll look at some of the most important challenges facing the engineering community, things like building our trust with the public, our role in combating misinformation and disinformation, and the leadership needed from the engineering community with respect to issues like we talked about today, cyber threats, but other challenges as well. So you can learn more about these events on our website. We have an events page. We would welcome all of you, and we would also appreciate it if you can spread the word in your organizations about our work and our events. So thanks again for all your participation today. And as Kyle said, look for communication from me as we share the documents and the results of today's discussion. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone. Nice being with you.
Thank you.